Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first thing Greg registered was not the sound of the screaming, which was still distant, a frayed thread of noise on the wind, but the texture of the damp, splintered wood beneath his palm. He was leaning against the railing of the town pier, the salt-soaked pine feeling like the skin of something long drowned and petrified. It was a cold that seeped up through the skin of his hand, into the bones of his wrist. A deep and ancient chill that the afternoon sun, weak and pale as a cataract eye, could not hope to warm. He pushed himself away, the ghost of that cold lingering, and turned toward the sound. The town of Haven's End was a frayed knot of clapboard houses and shingled shops clinging to the granite teeth of the Maine coast. It was a place of muted colors, of grays and bleached blues, where the air always tasted of salt and decay, of things pulled from the deep and left to dry in the sun. The scream came again, sharper now, a needle of pure fear stitching through the low, constant grumble of the sea. Greg moved, his boots heavy on the planks, his uniform shirt sticking to his back with a dampness that had nothing to do with the weather. Down on the stony beach, a small crowd had gathered, a huddle of dark coats against the gray shore. They parted for him, their faces pale ovals of shock. Old Man Henderson was on his knees, his hands hovering over what was left of his dog, a black lab named Buster. The dog was not just dead, it was unmade. It lay in a slick, dark ruin of flesh and splintered bone, unspooled across the wet stones, as if it had been torn apart by industrial machinery. The smell was a thick, coppery wave, undercut by the low-tide stench of rot and exposed viscera. There were no clear bite marks, no neat punctures. It was a dissolution, a violent coming undone. "It just came out of the water," Henderson whispered, his voice raspy and broken. Tentacle, Greg, like a great black rope, thick as my thigh. It snatched Buster right off the lead. There was a pull, and then this. He gestured weakly at the red mess. It was so fast. Greg felt the world tilt. A tentacle. The word was absurd, a fragment from a bad sailor's yarn. He looked past the old man, past the shocked faces of the townspeople, to the water. The sea was a sullen, leaden sheet, heaving with a slow, rhythmic pulse. It hid its depths, its secrets, behind a million shifting facets of gray light. It gave nothing back. Later, in the cramped town hall that served as his station, Greg stared at the corkboard. He had pinned up the few reports he had. Old Man Henderson's dog. The disappearance of the Gundersons' prize sheep from a pasture that edged the cliffs. The shredded empty lobster traps hauled up by the Johansson brothers, the buoys themselves snapped clean. And now, this morning, a young couple, tourists from Boston. Their rented kayaks found drifting, empty. One of them cracked in half. The fiberglass edges strangely softened, almost melted. There were no bodies to recover. The sea had taken its tribute and closed its mouth. The door opened, letting in a gust of damp, cold air, and Dylan, the marine biologist from the small university research outpost on the point. Dylan was a quiet man with eyes the color of the winter sea, and he carried with him the smell of formaldehyde and the deep ocean. He didn't greet Greg, just walked to the board and stared. Henderson said it was a tentacle, Greg said, the words feeling foolish in his mouth. Dylan was silent for a long time. He wasn't lying, he finally said, his voice low. "I've been taking water samples. The chemistry is wrong. There's an enzyme, a complex protein I can't identify. It's a powerful digestive agent. It would explain the state of the dog's body. And the kayak? He turned to Greg, and his eyes were full of a terrible, knowing light. There are things in the deep, Greg. Things we've never seen. The pressure down there is a world of its own. A world of silence and crushing dark. Sometimes, things from that world come up. And I'm unsure. What kind of things? Greg asked, though he did not want to know. Something old, Dylan whispered. Something that doesn't belong in our world of light and air. Its biology would be a nightmare. Its mind, if it has one, would be utterly alien. The fear in Haven's End began to curdle. It started as a nervousness, a reluctance to walk too close to the water's edge after dusk. Then the fishing boats began to stay in the harbor, their owners muttering about bad luck and twisted nets. The summer people, the lifeblood of the town's economy, cut their vacations short, fleeing the grim faces and the new, unsettling silence that had fallen over the cove. The town was dying, not with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating dread, choked by the fog that now seemed to cling to the shore with a possessive intent. It was in this atmosphere of simmering panic that Caleb found Greg. Caleb was a relic, a grizzled hunter and fisherman whose family had lived in Haven's End for generations. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles carved by wind and salt, and his eyes held the flat, patient gleam of a man who has spent his life killing things. He smelled of gun oil and damp wool. "You know what's out there, Chief," Caleb said, his voice a low rasp. It wasn't a question. It's the deep one. The old stories my grandfather told. A great beast that sleeps in the trench beyond the shelf. It wakes when the currents change, when the world is ripe. It's hungry. There are no such things as sea monsters, Caleb, Greg said, the authority in his voice, sounding hollow even to himself. Caleb smiled, a thin, cruel slash. That's what the fish think right before the hook takes them. It's here, and it's not leaving. You can hide in your office, or you can go out there and meet it. He leaned in close, and Greg could smell the old tobacco on his breath. I've been waiting for it my whole life. I have the boat. I have the harpoons. I just need the law to look the other way. That night, the storm came. It was a fury born over the open Atlantic. A great, roaring beast that slammed into Haven's End with the force of a god's hammer. The wind howled, a maddened chorus in the wires, and the rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. The power died, plunging the town into a primordial darkness, broken only by the frantic stabs of flashlight beams. And above the storm's cacophony, a new sound arose. A deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to come not from the sky or the wind, but from the water itself. It was a sound that vibrated in the teeth, in the marrow of the bones, a low, cellular call that spoke of vast, lightless places. Greg stood at the window of the station, watching the sea. In the strobe light flashes of lightning, he saw it. The water in the cove was churning, not with the storm's chaos, but with a purpose. Something immense was moving just below the surface, a darkness within the darkness, a solidity that displaced the sea itself. A long, black, glistening limb, thicker than the trunk of an ancient oak, rose from the waves for a moment, slick and studded with pale, sucking discs, before sliding back beneath the foam with a sound like a mountain sigh. He knew then. Caleb was right. Hiding was over. The next morning, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, the three of them motored out of the harbor in Caleb's boat, the Persephone. It was a stout wooden lobster boat, scarred and weathered, but its engine had a strong, defiant heart. Greg stood at the bow, the police-issue rifle in his hands, feeling like a child's toy. Dylan was amidships, staring at a portable depth finder, its screen a frantic, chaotic mess of returns. Caleb was at the wheel, his face a mask of grim exultation, his hands resting on a custom-built harpoon gun bolted to the deck, its steel tip gleaming with a cruel, sharp light. The town receded behind them, a smudge of gray on the gray shore, swallowed by the mist. The silence on the boat was heavy, broken only by the growl of the engine and the slap of waves against the hull. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, as if they were sailing out of the world and into a memory of the world, a place where the rules had been forgotten. Dylan's machine began to ping, a sharp, insistent sound. "It's here," he said, his voice tight. "Below us, it's massive. The size of a freighter. It's just holding position." The water around the Persephone grew still, unnaturally so. The choppy waves smoothed into a great, black, oily plain. The thrumming started again, that deep, resonant vibration that made the fillings in Greg's teeth ache. He could feel it in the deck, in the very air. Then the sea erupted. It was not a limb this time, but the thing itself, or a part of it, a vast, leathery mantle of a color that had no name, a shifting, iridescent black that seemed to drink the light. It was covered in a forest of writhing, rope-like tentacles, and at its center, where a head should be, was a pulsating, gelatinous mass shot through with veins of sickly phosphorescence. There was no face, no eyes, only a vast alien geometry of flesh that defied the mind's comprehension. It rose and rose, a living mountain, blotting out the sky. The smell was overwhelming, a miasma of the deep abyss, of brine and ammonia and ages of forgotten rot. Caleb was screaming, a raw, triumphant roar, and he fired the harpoon. The steel shaft flew true and sank deep into the glistening hide with a wet, thudding impact. The creature did not cry out. It made no sound a human ear could recognize. It simply reacted. The water around the boat boiled. A tentacle, swift as a cracking whip, lashed out and wrapped around Caleb's waist. There was a wet, crunching pop, and Caleb was gone, pulled into the churning black water without a sound. The harpoon rope went taut, and with a sound of screaming metal, the gun and a section of the deck were torn clean from the boat. The Persephone lurched violently. Greg was thrown to the deck, the rifle skittering away. He looked up to see Dylan standing frozen, not in fear, but in a kind of rapt, terrible awe, his face illuminated by the creature's eldritch glow. "It's beautiful," Dylan whispered, and in that moment, Greg saw that the biologist had not come to fight the monster, but to meet his god. A second tentacle, thinner, almost delicate, shot from the water and touched Dylan's forehead. It was not an attack. It was a caress. Dylan's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back in his head. A stream of images, not his own, flooded his mind. The crushing silence of the abyss, the slow dance of impossible life forms, the cold, patient passage of millennia, a consciousness so vast and ancient that his own was less than a single-celled organism in comparison. He did not scream. He simply folded to the deck, his mind wiped clean, a vacant vessel. Greg was alone. The boat was listing, taking on water. The great beast was sinking back beneath the waves. Its work done, its curiosity sated. It left behind only the churning water and the fading subsonic thrum that vibrated in the ruins of Greg's soul. He crawled to the side of the boat and looked down into the water. For a moment, in the dark, clear depths, he saw it. Not the monster, but an eye. An eye the size of a dinner plate, of a color that did not exist in the world of light. A pupil, a slit of infinite blackness. It looked at him. It saw the small, frantic, temporary thing that he was, and then it was gone. The wind, which had stilled, began to blow again, a low, mournful sound across the water. The waves, gentle now, lifted the wreckage of the Persephone and began to push it, piece by piece, toward the shore. Greg clung to a floating section of the gunwale, his body numb with a cold that had nothing to do with the sea. He watched the dark water, the shifting fog, the empty, indifferent sky. By the time what was left of the boat washed up on the stones of Haven's End, the wind had grown stronger. It whispered through the empty streets, rattling the signs on the closed shops, moaning in the chimneys of the abandoned houses. It pulled the fog in from the sea, a great, gray, silent tide that smothered the town, swallowing the outlines of the buildings, the shape of the pier, the very memory of the people who had lived there. The waves, relentless and eternal, climbed the shore, covering the stones, the splintered wood, the last fading footprints. They took it all, pulling the silence and the darkness down into the deep, where it would wait, patient and hungry, for the next waking of the world. He did not remember the rescue, if it could be called that. There were hands pulling him from the wreckage, voices that were muffled and distant, as if heard from the far end of a long, flooded tunnel. They laid him on the stones, wrapped him in a coarse wool blanket that scratched his face. He could not stop shivering. The cold was inside him, a coarse sample of the deep ocean lodged in his spine. They asked him questions. Where was Caleb? Where was Dylan? What happened out there? He opened his mouth, but the only thing that came out was a low, choked sound. The memory of that eye, the sheer, placid indifference of it, had cauterized his ability to speak. He simply shook his head, his own gaze fixed on the horizon line where the gray sea met the gray sky. They took him to his small house on the edge of town. For days, he sat in a chair by the window, watching the fog. It never lifted. It clung to Heaven's End like a shroud, a permanent, damp pall that muted sound and bleached color from the world. The town was emptying, a quiet, steady exodus. He heard the rumble of trucks, the slamming of car doors, the last, desperate arguments of those who did not want to leave. He did not try to stop them. His authority was a ghost, a meaningless title from a world that no longer existed. The phone in the station rang sometimes, a shrill, lonely sound in the empty building. He never answered it. What would he say? That a monster from the abyss had looked at him and found him insignificant? That the sea, which had given the town its life, had now decided to reclaim it? A week after the storm, he forced himself to walk down to the pier. The planks were slick with condensation, the air thick with the smell of salt and rot. The few boats left in the harbor knocked against their moorings with a hollow, rhythmic sound, like bones tapping together. He saw Mrs. Henderson staring out at the water, her face a mask of grief. She did not look at him. No one did. They knew he had gone out to face the thing, and had come back broken. He was a reminder of their powerlessness. He found himself standing at the exact spot where he had been leaning when he first heard the scream that started it all. He placed his palm back on the damp, splintered wood of the railing. The cold was still there, the same ancient chill. But now, he understood it. It wasn't the cold of death. It was the cold of waiting. It was the patient, eternal cold of the deep. And it had always been here, in the wood, in the stones, in the air they breathed. They had just built their town on top of it and pretended it wasn't there. That night, the thrumming returned. It was softer this time, a vibration felt more than heard, a bass note that hummed up through the foundations of the houses. It was not a threat. It was a presence, a statement. Greg lay in his bed, listening to it. He did not feel fear anymore. The fear had been burned away, leaving behind a hollow, resonant understanding. In the morning, he packed a single bag. He did not look back as he walked to his car. He drove slowly through the fog-wrapped streets, past the closed general store, the shuttered diner, the empty houses with their blank, dark windows. He was the last one to leave. As he reached the town line, he stopped the car and got out. He looked back at Haven's End. The fog had almost completely consumed it. Only the very tops of the tallest church spires were visible, like the masts of sunken ships. He got back in the car and drove. He did not know where he was going, only that it had to be inland, toward mountains, toward a place where the air was dry and the ground was solid, and you could not smell the sea. But hours later, stopped at a gas station in a bright, loud world that felt like a dream, he caught a scent on the wind, a faint, familiar tang of salt and decay. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel and saw the ghost of the damp, splintered wood. He knew then that he could drive forever, but he would never truly leave. The deep had left its mark on him, and the cold was in his bones to stay. The road stretched out before him, a gray ribbon cutting through endless, anonymous pine forests. He drove for 2 days, stopping only for gas and bad coffee. The radio a blur of static and cheerful, meaningless voices. He found a motel in a town whose name he forgot as soon as he saw it, a place of strip malls and the flat, hard light of sodium vapor lamps. He paid for a week in cash, the bills damp from his clammy hands. The room smelled of mildew and disinfectant. He lay on the stiff bedspread, the ceiling a blank screen onto which his mind projected the same unending reel. The wet thud of the harpoon, the crunch of Caleb's body, the terrible, knowing emptiness in Dylan's eyes, and always the eye, that vast alien eye regarding him from the abyss. It was not malevolent. That would have been easier to process, a simple emotion he could fight or flee. It was simply observant, the way a man might idly watch an ant cross a pavement before moving on. Sleep, when it came, was not an escape. He dreamed of pressure, of a great silent weight pushing down on him from all sides, forcing the air from his lungs and the thoughts from his head. He dreamed of floating in the black, surrounded by faint, pulsing lights that were not lights, but living things whose shapes made his mind ache. He would wake gasping, the taste of salt and ammonia thick in his throat, the low, thrumming vibration still echoing in his bones, even in the absolute silence of the motel room. On the 3rd day, he forced himself to go to a diner across the street. The clatter of plates and the bright artificial cheer felt like an assault. He ordered eggs and stared at them as they congealed on the plate. A man at the counter was reading a newspaper. A small, buried headline on page 7 caught Greg's eye. Fishing community abandoned. Unexplained exodus from Haven's End. The article was brief, speculative, citing economic hardship and a generational shift. There was no mention of monsters, of course. The world had already turned the page. It didn't want to know. He left the diner and walked aimlessly through the town. He found himself standing on a bridge over a small, sluggish river. He looked down at the brown water, at the shopping cart, and the tangle of branches caught against the concrete pier. For a dizzying moment, he imagined something rising from those shallow, muddy depths. A slick, black tendril, a flash of impossible color. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white. It was here, too. Not the creature itself, but the idea of it. The knowledge that beneath the thin crust of the world, in the dark and the cold, things waited that did not care for his laws or his understanding. He returned to his motel room and turned on the television. A nature documentary was playing, showing footage of the deep ocean. A grotesque fish with a glowing lure waved in the blackness. The narrator's voice was calm, educational. In the crushing pressures of the abyssopelagic zone, life takes on forms that seem alien to us. Greg switched it off. He sat in the growing dark, the remote control limp in his hand. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the same silence he had felt on the boat just before the thing rose from the water. The same silence that had fallen over Haven's End. He realized he had not escaped it. He had carried it with him, a bubble of deep ocean quiet in the middle of the noisy, oblivious world. He stood up and went to the small, grimy window, pulling the curtain aside. The parking lot was quiet. Beyond it, the lights of the town glowed, a feeble attempt to hold back the night. But he saw past them now. He saw the fundamental darkness that they tried to mask, the ancient, patient dark that was the true state of things. The thing in the sea was not an invader. It was a revealer. It had pulled back a curtain and shown him the backstage of reality, a place of vast, mindless forces, an eternal, hungry dark. He let the curtain fall back into place. There was nowhere left to run. The chase was over. He was not the hunter, nor was he the protector. He was the witness. And the cold, deep truth was that he had not been running away from the sea. He had been carrying a piece of it inside him all along, and now, in the quiet of this anonymous room, it was finally coming home. He did not unpack his bag. He simply left it by the door, a useless artifact from a life that no longer fit. The hum in his bones was a constant companion now. A tuning fork struck against the foundation of the world, and it resonated with the silence in a way that was almost musical. He stopped trying to eat the food that tasted of nothing, stopped trying to sleep in the bed that felt like a slab of stone. Days bled into nights marked only by the changing light through the thin curtains. The television screen remained a dark, dusty rectangle. The world outside the window continued its frantic, meaningless dance, but he was no longer a part of it. He was an observer behind glass, watching a species he had once belonged to scurry about, unaware of the abyss that yawned just beneath their feet. One evening, a storm rolled in, not like the one in Haven's End, but a common terrestrial thunderstorm. The rain lashed the motel roof and the wind rattled the window frame. But to Greg, it was a pale imitation, a child's tantrum compared to the godly fury he had witnessed. He stood at the window, watching the rain streak the glass, and he saw not water, but the black, churning sea. He smelled not wet asphalt, but the deep ammoniac stench of the creature's hide. The phone on the nightstand rang, a jarring metallic sound he had ignored for days. On the seventh ring, some old automated part of him moved to answer it. It was the motel manager, his voice tinny and annoyed, asking about his extended stay. Greg held the receiver to his ear but said nothing. He could only listen to the man's impatience, the mundane concern over payment and room keys, and it sounded like the chirping of an insect. The manager's voice faded, replaced by a low, rushing static that grew in volume until it filled his head. It was the sound of the deep, the sound of vast, empty spaces, and it was calling him home. He hung up the phone gently. The decision was not a conscious one. It was an acceptance, a final surrender to the gravity that had been pulling at him since he first looked into that eye. He picked up his car keys, their cold metal familiar in his hand. He did not drive toward the mountains. He turned east, back the way he had come. The storm had passed, leaving the night clear and cold. He drove through the sleeping towns, their streetlights creating lonely pools of orange in the immense darkness. The further he drove, the more the hum in his bones seemed to quiet, not from absence, but from harmony. He was getting closer to the source. He reached the coast as a dull, gray dawn was breaking. He abandoned his car on the cliff road overlooking what was left of Haven's End. The fog was still there, a solid wall of gray, but it parted for him as he walked down the overgrown path, as if it had been waiting. The town was a ghost, windows shattered, doors hanging open, everything softened and made ancient by a layer of damp moss and salt crust. The silence was absolute. He walked to the end of the broken pier, his steps sure and steady on the rotten wood. The water in the cove was black and perfectly calm, a sheet of obsidian. He stood there for a long time, looking down into the depths. He saw his reflection, a gaunt, hollowed-out man, and then he saw past it. He saw the darkness that had always been there, the ancient, patient darkness that was not empty, but full. The thrumming began again, not as a sound, but as a feeling of rightness, of homecoming. It vibrated up from the pilings, through the soles of his feet, and into his heart. He took off his jacket, let it fall to the planks. The air was cold, but the cold was inside him already, and it welcomed him. He did not jump. He simply stepped off the edge, a slow, deliberate descent into the black water. The shock of the cold was brief, and then it was just warmth, the warmth of returning. The water closed over his head without a sound. He sank, his eyes open, watching the silver surface recede above him into a distant, shimmering memory. The pressure built, a comforting embrace. Below, in the infinite black, a soft, phosphorescent glow began to pulse, a light that had no counterpart in the world above. He swam toward it, and the last of the air left his lungs, not in a panicked rush, but in a quiet, contented sigh. He was not drowning. He was finally breathing. The light was not a single source, but a constellation of shifting patterns that resolved into forms his mind could almost grasp. Vast, impossible architectures of living coral that pulsed with a soft, internal rhythm. Schools of creatures that were more light than flesh, swirling in silent, complex ballads. The crushing pressure was no longer a force to be resisted. It was the very element that held him together, that gave his new existence its shape and substance. The thrumming was all around him now, a symphony played on the strings of the deep earth, and he was a part of its harmony. He felt a presence beside him, not a shape, but a region of greater density in the water, a consciousness that enveloped his own without consuming it. It showed him things, not images this time, but understandings. The slow, tectonic dreams of the planet, the rise and fall of mountains, the birth and death of seas. He saw the brief, bright flicker of human civilization, a flash of fire on the surface, frantic and doomed to sputter out. It was not tragic. It was simply a note in a song that was billions of years long. There was no more Greg, the man, the harbor master, the failed protector. Those were shells he had shed, identities as temporary as the clothes that had rotted away from his body. What remained was a point of awareness, a witness integrated into a system vaster than he had ever dreamed. He had thought the eye in the depths was looking at him with indifference. He understood now that he had been wrong. It had been looking at a part of itself, a fragment that had briefly wandered into the light and was now returning. He drifted deeper, past landscapes that defied geometry, through forests of glassy spines and over plains of oozing, crystalline sludge. Time became meaningless. 1,000 years might have passed, or a single moment. He felt the others then, the ones who had come before, not their individual selves, but their essences, woven into the great tapestry of the deep's memory. He felt the quiet, resigned presence of Dylan, his mind now a calm pool in the vast network of thought. He felt others from other times, other shores, all drawn back to this silent, eternal heart. On the surface, the world continued. The waves eventually ground the last of the Persephone's wreckage into sand. The houses of Haven's End slumped into their foundations, were buried by dunes, and were forgotten. New towns were built on other coasts, their inhabitants never knowing what lay sleeping under the weight of the water. But sometimes, on the stillest of nights, a fisherman far out at sea would feel a sudden, profound chill, or see a light in the water that dove too deep and fast to be any fish. He would make a sign against evil and turn his boat toward the distant, comforting lights of the shore, unaware that what he had glimpsed was not a monster, but a sentinel, a part of the world's deep, slow pulse, waiting in the dark for the next turn of the great, slow wheel. The sentinel did not think, for thought was a frantic surface thing. It perceived. It felt the slow grind of continents, the heat bleeding from the planet's core, the pull of the moon on the endless mass of water above. It was aware of the scurrying things on the thin, sun-scorched crust, their brief, bright lives flaring and extinguishing like bubbles from a thermal vent. There was no judgment in this awareness, only a vast and patient recording. A new vibration reached it, a high-frequency shriek of metal and fire, a ship in distress far overhead. The sound was a pinprick, an irritation in the great, dark quiet. The sentinel shifted its attention, a process as slow as the growth of a seamount. It did not move toward the sound, but it extended a part of its consciousness, a tendril of intent, that subtly altered the pressure gradients and current flows for miles around. On the surface, the storm-tossed freighter, its engine dead, was being driven toward a razor-sharp reef. The crew, screaming prayers in a dozen languages, braced for the impact that would shatter the hull. But the impact never came. A strange, profound calm settled over the water. The waves, which had been mountains of black water, flattened into a slick, oily swell. An unnatural fog, cold and smelling of the deep, rolled in, blanketing the ship and blinding the radar. For 3 hours, the ship drifted, ghost-like, in this pocket of stillness, until the storm had passed it by. When the fog lifted, the reef was behind them, and the Coast Guard was on the horizon. The crew would tell a story of a miracle, of a divine intervention that saved them. They would never know that they had been spared not by a god, but by a reflex, an almost autonomic twitch from the depths. They had been an annoyance, a noise in the cathedral, and had been quietly shushed. The sentinel had already returned its focus to the slow, cold dreams of the abyss, where time was not measured in hours or years, but in the lifetime of stars. It waited, not for an end, but for the next inevitable change, a permanent part of the world's hidden, beating heart. He remembered the warmth of the sun on his face, a sensation from a lifetime ago. It was a memory that belonged to the man he had been, a fossil preserved in the sediment of his new consciousness. The concept of a face itself was fading, an anatomical detail as irrelevant as the name Greg. He was a nexus of perception, anchored to the cold, mineral-rich currents that flowed from the world's deepest fractures. Centuries passed, or perhaps it was only a single, long breath. The pressure around him was a constant, a familiar weight that was both his prison and his mantle of office. He felt the slow, inevitable shift as the human world above reached a fever pitch. The frantic vibrations of their machines became a constant, dull ache in the water, a sonic pollution that grated against the deep's natural frequencies. He felt the heating of the oceans, a sickly warmth that crept into even these lowest trenches, disturbing the ancient, stable communities of life that had never known change. Then came the silence. It was not the rich, full silence of the abyss, but a new, terrible quiet. The hum of ship engines ceased. The pings of sonar faded. The frantic, chattering vibrations of their world simply stopped. The great, frantic noise they had made for a brief geological moment was over. He knew, without needing to see, what had happened. The bright, brief flicker had burned itself out. The surface was quiet again, returning to a state it had not known for millennia. The deep had merely waited. It had always been waiting. A new task presented itself, not as a command, but as an instinct, a function of his being. It was time to reclaim, to cleanse. He felt a stirring in the darkness around him, not of individual creatures, but of the deep itself. From the fissures and the plains, forms began to rise. They were not the monsters of surface legend, but the true inhabitants, the janitors of the planet. They were shapes of gelid flesh and crystalline bone, things that fed on radiation and decay, that processed waste into new, stable forms of matter. He rose with them, not as a leader, but as a part of the tide. They broke the surface under a sky stained with strange, beautiful colors, the aftermath of the surface dwellers' final act. The air was thick with ash and the sweet, cloying scent of dissolution. The coastlines were altered, unrecognizable. Metal cities stood as empty, corroding skeletons. They moved inland, a slow, inexorable wave of life from the deepest, oldest part of the world, scouring the land of the delicate, poisonous artifacts left behind. They were not conquerors. They were the immune system of the earth, and the fever had broken. As they worked, he felt the planet begin to heal, the deep, resonant hum of its core growing stronger, purer, as the last echoes of the noisy infestation faded into geological history. He was where he was meant to be, a watchful eye in the dark, as the world once again became its true self. Story 2. The light from the oil lamp did not so much illuminate the room as fight a losing battle against the pressing dark. It was a small, golden heart beating irregularly in the chest of the old farmhouse, its pulse causing the shadows in the corners to swell and recede with a slow, tidal rhythm. Elara watched it from her nest of blankets on the floor. The flames dance reflected in the deep, liquid black of her eyes. She was 10, and the silence of the world was the only song she truly remembered. The quiet was not empty, not anymore. It was a thick, felt presence, a listener in its own right. Outside, the wind moved through the corpse of the cornfield, a dry, rustling whisper that was the closest thing to a voice the land had left. This was the third autumn after the world coughed itself still. The Sorrows, they called it, a gentle name for a brutal thing. It did not rage. It simply arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the humming of the planet had been dialed down to a faint, dying ember of sound. Elara's father, Thomas, had survived, a man built from gristle and quiet endurance. Her mother was a photograph on the mantel, a smile frozen in a world of gasoline and electricity. They lived in the stubborn shell of their family home, its bones good, its spirit hollowed out. Thomas spent his days tending a meager garden and reinforcing the fences, his movements slow and deliberate, a ritual against the encroaching wild. Then the dreams began. Not nightmares, not exactly. They were visitations of a profound and unsettling peace. Elara would find herself standing in a field of silver grass, under a sky strewn with unfamiliar constellations. A figure would be there, waiting. It was a man, or the shape of one, woven from moonlight and shadow. He had no discernible face, yet she felt his gaze, a tender pressure against her mind. He never spoke, but ideas would bloom in her consciousness, fully formed. The location of a forgotten cellar full of canned goods, the knowledge of which berries were safe to eat now that the old rules of nature had been rewritten. A profound sense of being watched over, being loved. She called him the quiet man. She told her father about him one evening as they ate a thin stew. Thomas listened, his fork pausing midair, his eyes clouding with a worry that was older than the Sorrows. "It's just dreams, Rabbit," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "The mind gets lonely. It makes up friends." But the dreams were a secret warmth in her chest, a glow that the gray world could not extinguish. The first stranger came with the first snow. His name was Samuel, and he arrived not with a shout or a threat, but with a stillness that was more alarming than any violence. He was a tall man, gaunt, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and a voice that was soft, melodic, and seemed to settle in the marrow of your bones. He spoke of a community he was building, a place called Haven, nestled in the valley beyond the dead river. He spoke of safety, of shared labor, of a future. His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of absolute conviction. Thomas, his instincts honed by solitude, was wary. But Samuel's gaze, when it fell upon Alara, was not one of curiosity, but of recognition. It was as if he had been looking for her. They followed him to heaven. It was not a town, but the ghost of one, a collection of repurposed buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. The people there moved with a quiet purpose, their faces serene, their eyes holding the same placid light as Samuel's. They welcomed Thomas and Alara without fanfare, as if they had always been expected. Life in Haven was orderly, peaceful. The food, while scarce, was shared equally. Watches were kept. Children were taught, and Samuel was their quiet center, their patient guide. He never raised his voice, never gave orders. He simply suggested, and the community moved as one to fulfill his vision. Alara felt a deep, humming contentment there, a sense of belonging that soothed the ragged edges of her loneliness. Her dreams of the quiet man grew less frequent, their comforting presence replaced by the tangible reality of Samuel's care. Yet, Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He noticed things. The absolute silence of the woods around Haven, a silence devoid of even the scuttling of insects. The way a people never seemed to dream, or if they did, they never spoke of it. The way Samuel would sometimes stand at the edge of the settlement at dusk, perfectly motionless, as if listening to a frequency only he could hear. And he noticed the other community, the one spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones. The Weepers, they were a savage group, it was said, led by a man named Malachi, who hoarded resources and worshipped the darkness that the sorrows had unleashed. They were the reason for the high walls, the constant watch. They were the enemy, the explicit evil in a world struggling for good. One evening, Alara, unable to sleep, wandered from the small house they had been given. She found Samuel in the old church that served as Haven's meeting hall. He was not praying. He was standing before the large, empty space where an altar once stood, his hands at his sides. The moonlight through the broken stained glass window cast his shadow on the wall behind him, a long, distorted thing that did not quite match his posture. It seemed thicker, more substantial, its edges crawling with a subtle, chaotic motion. As Alara watched, hidden in the doorway, the shadow turned its head, though Samuel did not move. It looked directly at her, and for a terrifying, exhilarating second, she saw not a monster, but the quiet man from her dreams, his form now cast in pure blackness. Then Samuel turned, his face a mask of gentle concern. "You should be asleep, little one," he said, and his voice was the same as always. But the shadow on the wall behind him was slowly, deliberately, raising a finger to where its lips would be. The revelation did not come as a shout, but as a slow, sickening unraveling. A scavenging party returned from a nearby town, one of their number bleeding from a gash on his arm. His name was Leo, a kind man with a laugh that had only recently returned to his eyes. As Samuel tended to the wound, his touch was gentle, his words soothing. But Thomas, standing close, saw the blood. It was not just red. It swam with threads of black, like tiny living worms that writhed and pulsed for a moment, before dissolving back into the crimson. Leo's eyes fluttered, and a look of ecstatic peace settled on his face. "I see it now," he whispered. The beautiful silence. From that day, Leo was changed. His serenity was absolute, his loyalty to Samuel ferocious. He no longer dreamed. He no longer seemed to want. Thomas confronted Samuel that night in the church. Confrontation was not loud. It was a tense, whispered exchange in the vast, dark space. "What are you?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a profound, soul-deep revulsion. Samuel smiled, a patient, sorrowful thing. "I am the physician, Thomas. The world was sick with noise, with desire, with the chaos of individual will. The sorrows was not a plague. It was a scalpel. It cut away the fever. I am merely helping the patient heal." air, merely helping the patient heal. Yeah, you're changing them. You're making them, not them. I am giving them peace, Samuel replied, his voice hypnotic, filling the space. The weepers, Malachi, they cling to the old sickness. They scream their individuality, their passions, their greed. They are the final convulsions of the dying world. I am the stillness that comes after. I am the quiet at the end of your daughter's dream. And Thomas understood. There was no struggle between good and evil. There was only a struggle between two different kinds of damnation. Malachi and his weepers represented the death of the body, the descent into base, violent survival. But Samuel offered the death of the soul, the serene, placid, and absolute end of everything that made a human being. He was not a savior. He was the curator of a beautiful, silent museum, and he was collecting the last living exhibits. The climax was not a battle, but a choice. Malachi's followers attacked Haven, a screaming, desperate horde of painted faces and flashing knives. They were the wild ID to Samuel's cold superego. As chaos erupted, the clash of metal, the guttural cries, the smell of smoke and blood, Samuel stood unmoved in the center of the square. He raised his hands, not in defense, but in invitation. And from the quiet, orderly houses of Haven, his followers emerged. Their faces were calm. They moved with a unified, terrible purpose. They did not fight with rage, but with a chilling efficiency, disarming the weepers not to kill, but to embrace them. Thomas saw Leo hold a weeping, struggling man, whispering into his ear until the man's struggles ceased, and a vacant smile spread across his face. Samuel was not fighting the infection. He was spreading it. Thomas found Ilara hiding in the root cellar. He took her hand, his own scarred and rough. "We have to go, Rabbit. Right now." But as they turned to flee, Samuel was there, blocking the doorway. He was not looking at Thomas. His gaze was fixed on Ilara. "You feel it, don't you?" he said, his voice a soft caress. The hum, the beautiful, silent hum of the world as it should be. You have always been able to hear it. That is why I call to you. You are to be my heir. The new world needs a gentle heart to guide its long, quiet dream. Ilara looked from Samuel's serene face to her father's, which was a landscape of terror and love. She felt the pull of the quiet man, the promise of an end to all pain, all fear, all loneliness. It was a warm, heavy blanket offered on the coldest night of her life. But she also saw the fierce, flawed, desperate love in her father's eyes. It was messy. It was loud. It was human. "No," she said. The word was small, but it echoed in the stone cellar like a gunshot. Samuel's smile did not falter, but the air around him grew cold. His shadow, cast by the single bulb overhead, began to bleed across the floor, not as an absence of light, but as a substance, thick and tar-like. It slid towards them, and in its surface, Ilara saw not her own reflection, but 1,000 faces, all frozen in the same state of blissful, eternal silence. Thomas did not hesitate. He shoved Ilara behind him and charged, not at Samuel, but at the old, rotting support beam near the door. He slammed his body against it, once, twice, with the strength of a final, absolute refusal. Wood splintered. The world groaned. And the cellar, and the house above it, gave up its long fight with gravity and came down upon them all. Ilara woke to dust and pain. She was buried in a pocket of rubble, a sliver of gray dawn light piercing through a crack. She could hear nothing. No screams, no fighting, no wind. Just the ringing, absolute silence. She clawed her way out, her small hands bleeding, into the ruins of Haven. The settlement was destroyed. Bodies lay everywhere, weepers and the people of Haven alike. Their struggle ended by the collapsing architecture. And there, near the center, pinned under a massive oak beam, was Samuel. He was not dead. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes held not peace, but a deep, cosmic sorrow. "It did not have to be this way," he whispered, blood trickling from his lips. "The noise will return, the pain. The beautiful silence is broken." Elara walked towards him. She saw her father's hand, still and pale, protruding from another pile of stone and wood. A sound escaped her then, a small, broken thing that was the opposite of Samuel's silence. It was the sound of a heart breaking. Samuel's body shuddered. You must take up the song. The final song. It is the only way to keep the old world from screaming itself back to life." He began to speak then, not in English, but in a language of sighs and hums, a series of resonant syllables that felt both alien and deeply, terrifyingly familiar. It was a formula, a pattern, a ritual. It was the quiet at the end of her dream-given voice. He made her repeat it, again and again, his eyes burning into hers, until the words were etched into her soul, a permanent recording. When she had memorized the last, haunting note, Samuel closed his eyes. A final soft breath left his body, and the intelligence behind his eyes vanished, leaving only the empty shell of a man. Elara stood alone in the ruins. The sun was rising, a pale, indifferent eye. She was the last one, the keeper of a terrible secret. She walked away from Haven, away from the graves of her father and the two false prophets. She walked for days, then weeks, a small, solitary figure in the vast, wounded land. She found no other survivors. Perhaps they were hiding. Perhaps they were all gone. The world was quiet again, but it was Samuel's quiet, a silence waiting to be filled. And so each night as the stars emerged, the same stars, yet somehow colder, Elara would stop wherever she was, in a forest clearing or on the skeleton of a highway, and she would open her mouth, and she would sing the song Samuel had taught her. It was not a melody. It was a negation, a lullaby for a dead planet. Her voice, small and clear, would weave through the darkness. Let the light fade from the sky. Let the last echo of a memory die. Let the wind forget the words to its own mournful sigh. Let the world lie still and never ask why. Let the light fade from the sky. Let the last echo of a memory die. Let the wind forget the words to its own mournful sigh. Let the world lie still and never ask why. Over and over the chant, a soft hammer beating the nails into the coffin of what was. It was a prayer for an end to prayers, a story with no one left to tell it. She was the last human, and her only purpose was to ensure the silence was final. And as she sang, the shadows around her would deepen, not with menace, but with a profound and grateful peace. And the unsteady light of the stars themselves seemed to flicker and listen and begin, ever so slowly, to forget how to shine. The song became her breath and her heartbeat. It was the first thing she did upon waking, and the last thing she did before the fragile, dreamless sleep took her. She walked a world scrubbed, clean of history, her small feet leaving temporary marks on the dust of forgotten roads. Seasons turned, but they did so softly, as if afraid to make a sound. The winters were less biting, the summers less fierce. It was as if the planet itself was succumbing to the lullaby, settling into a deep and final repose. One afternoon, she found a single stubborn dandelion pushing through a crack in the asphalt. Its yellow was a violent shout of color in the gray landscape. She knelt, her song faltering for the first time in months. The memory of making a wish and blowing the seeds came to her, not as a clear picture, but as a ghost of a feeling, a faint, warm pressure in her chest. She reached out a thin finger to touch the petals. As she did, the words of the song stuck in her throat. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was no longer peaceful. It was hungry. That night, she did not sing. She sat huddled in the shell of a gas station, the cold seeping through her warm clothes. The silence pressed in, a physical weight on her eardrums. It was no longer Samuel's serene quiet. It was the silence of a held breath, waiting for her to give it permission to be permanent. She felt the weight of the song inside her, a coiled serpent of oblivion. To sing it was to erase the dandelion. To sing it was to agree that her father's love, her mother's photograph, were echoes that deserved to die. The next morning, she tried to force the words out. They felt like ash on her tongue. She walked on, her silence a new kind of noise. She began to see other signs she had been blind to, or had sung into nothingness. A child's red mitten, frozen in a mud puddle. The faint, weathered outline of a hopscotch grid on a sidewalk. Each one was a pinprick of light in the overwhelming dark, a memory that refused to be smoothed away. She came to a river, wide and slow, its surface a perfect, unmoving sheet of gray. On the opposite bank, a figure stood. It was not the quiet man. It was a real person, a woman, just as thin and ragged as Alara. She was staring across the water, her hand shielding her eyes. When she saw Alara, she did not wave or call out. She simply stood, watching. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Another person, a listener. The song rose in her throat, an instinct, a compulsion to finish her work, to complete the beautiful, terrible silence. She opened her mouth. The first syllable, the one that meant, "Let the light fade," formed on her lips. But what came out was a different word. It was small, rusted from disuse, and shattered the stillness like glass. "Hello." The sound hung in the air, a fragile, impossible thing. The woman on the other side did not respond for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand. She cupped it around her ear, a universal question. Alara tried again. She pushed the lullaby down into the depths of herself, and reached for the old, noisy, painful words. "My name," she said, her voice a little stronger, "is Alara." The woman across the river stood perfectly still. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the gray trees on the other side. Alara stood on the bank, the current of the dead river the only movement. She had broken the song. She had introduced a crack in the perfect silence. She did not know if the woman was a friend or a foe, if she was alone or part of a group. She did not know if the world could be saved, or if it was even worth saving. But as she stood there, the hunger in the silence began to recede, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating uncertainty. The stars above had not forgotten how to shine. They were only waiting for someone to remember their names. And Alara, the last singer of the end of the world, decided she would not sing tonight. She would wait and see what the noise would bring. She did not cross the river. Not that day. The water was too deep, the current deceptively strong, and the act felt too much like a pursuit. She had thrown a stone into the stillness, and now she had to wait for the ripples. She made a camp just back from the bank, hidden in a thicket of brambles, and she waited. The compulsion to sing the lullaby was a physical ache, a tremor in her muscles. The silence felt wrong now, itchy and incomplete. To soothe herself, she began to hum, not the quieting song, but a fragment of a melody her father used to whistle while fixing things around their old home. It was a broken, tuneless thing, but it was hers. On the third morning, she saw smoke, a thin, gray tendril rising from the other side of the river, a little ways downstream. It was not the wild smoke of a forest fire, but the controlled, deliberate smoke of a campfire. An answer. Her heart, a dormant creature in her chest, stirred and beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She spent the day gathering her courage, watching the smoke signal as it pulsed and faded with the wind. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, she saw him. A man emerging from the trees on the opposite bank. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes a patchwork of hides and faded cloth. He carried a long, crude spear. He stood at the water's edge, looking directly at her thicket, and raised an empty hand. It was not a wave, but a show of peace. Then he pointed downstream to a place where a fallen tree created a precarious, natural bridge across the river. It was an invitation, or a test. Elara's fingers tightened around the strap of her worn pack. She thought of Samuel's serene damnation and her father's desperate, loving eyes. She thought of the woman who had walked away. This was the noise. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. It could be Malachi's kind of violence or Samuel's kind of poison, but it was also the opposite of the song. It was a question, not an answer. She stood up and stepped out of the brambles. She saw the man tense, his grip on the spear tightening. She mirrored his gesture, raising her own empty hands. Then she nodded. She began to walk toward the fallen tree. The crossing was treacherous. The bark was slick. The trunk bowed under its own weight, dipping close to the dark, cold water. Halfway across, she looked down into the current and saw her reflection, a pale, wide-eyed ghost. For a terrifying second, she saw Samuel's face superimposed over her own, his lips moving in the first words of the lullaby. She froze, gripping the rough branches. The man on the other side had not moved. He watched her, his expression unreadable. He made no move to help her, but his presence was an anchor. He was waiting. He was witnessing her choice. Elara took a shuddering breath, pushed the phantom's voice from her mind, and took another step. Then another. Soon, her feet found the solid ground of the opposite bank. She stood before him, small and trembling. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. The man's eyes, a startling light gray, scanned her face. They were not serene like Samuel's followers, nor wild like the weepers. They were tired, deeply tired, but they were alert. They were alive. "Elara," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. It was the most beautiful sound she had heard in years. She simply nodded, her own voice lost again. "The woman you saw, my sister," she said. A ghost spoke to her from across the water. He paused, his gaze intense. "We have a rule. We do not speak to the quiet ones. Their silence is a contagion." "I'm not one of them," Elara whispered. "We have another rule," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "We do not speak to the weepers. Their noise is a different kind of death." "Which am I?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "That," he said, lowering his spear so the point was in the dirt, "is what we are trying to decide. My name is Caleb. You will come with me. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will be watched." He turned and began to walk toward the trees, not looking back to see if she followed. Elara stood for a moment, the weight of his distrust a heavy cloak. But underneath it, she felt something she had almost forgotten, the terrifying, fragile and necessary burden of a future. She took a step, then another, following Caleb into the noisy, uncertain dark. The path was narrow and overgrown, but clearly used. Caleb moved with a quiet grace, his steps making almost no sound. Elara tried to mimic him, but every snapped twig under her foot sounded like a gunshot in the hushed woods. They walked for what felt like an hour, the only light coming from the sliver of a moon overhead. Finally, the trees thinned, revealing a small, hidden valley, a cluster of low, camouflaged shelters, nestled against a rocky outcrop. A handful of people moved between them, their movements efficient and quiet. This was not a community built on dreams or fanaticism. It was built on survival. All activity stopped as they entered the camp. Eyes, hard and wary, tracked Ilaris' every move. She saw the woman from the riverbank standing by a fire, her expression guarded. Caleb led Ilara to a small, isolated lean-to at the edge of the camp. "You will stay here tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We will bring you water and food. Do not leave this spot." He left her there, and she sat on the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. The camp was not silent. There were whispers, the soft crackle of the fire, the sound of someone sharpening a tool. It was a fragile, human music, and it was terrifying. She had carried the end of the world in her throat for so long that its absence felt like a physical wound. She could feel the lullaby coiled at the base of her skull, a sleeping dragon. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and she could unleash it. She could give these people the peace they probably craved. The thought was a seductive, monstrous whisper. An older woman with a deeply lined face brought her a bowl of thin broth and a cup of water. She did not speak, but her eyes, dark and intelligent, studied Ilara with a curiosity that was not entirely hostile. Ilara drank the water first, the coolness a shock to her system. The broth was salty and warm, and it awakened a gnawing hunger she had suppressed for years. Later, as the camp settled into a watchful sleep, Caleb returned. He sat on the ground a few feet from her, the firelight carving shadows into his face. "The quiet ones," he began without preamble. "We find them sometimes. They are like dolls. They do not resist. They do not speak. They just are. They are the most dangerous of all because their poison is invisible. It makes you want to lie down and stop fighting." He looked at her, his gray eyes piercing. "You are not like them. There is a storm in you. A war. Mare." Ilara wrapped her arms around herself. "Samuel, the quiet man. He gave me a song. He said it was the only way. And you sang it," Caleb stated. "I did. For a long time." She looked up, meeting his gaze. I stopped. "Why?" She thought of the dandelion, the red mitten, the hopscotch grid, the small, stubborn artifacts of a world that refused to be completely erased. But most of all, she thought of the choice. "Because my father taught me that love is louder," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb was silent for a long time. The fire popped and hissed between them. "We are not a tribe," he said finally. "We are a warning system. We watch for the weepers. We avoid the quiet ones. We scavenge. We survive. We do not hope for a better world. We only hope to see the next sunrise." He stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants. "Your song, this only way. If it is a weapon, we need to know. If it is a sickness, we cannot let you stay." He left her again with the weight of his words. She understood. They were not going to welcome her. They were going to judge her. Her value, her right to exist in this last, tiny pocket of noisy humanity, depended on what she carried inside. She was not a person to them. She was a question, and in the morning they would demand an answer. She lay down on the hard ground, the lullaby humming in her bones, and stared at the stars through the opening of the lean-to, waiting for the dawn and the verdict it would bring. The dawn came, gray and cold. Ilara had not slept. The song felt like a living thing inside her, a second heartbeat that pulsed with a rhythm of finality. She could feel its power, the seductive promise of an end to all struggle, all fear. To these people, it would be the ultimate temptation, a sweet poison. She understood why Caleb saw it as a contagion. She was given more water and a piece of tough, dried meat. The people in the camp went about their tasks, but their eyes never truly left her. They were assessing her, measuring the threat. The woman from the river, whose name she learned was Anya, brought her the food. Her eyes were the same clear gray as her brother's, but held a flicker of something else. Not pity, but a deep, resonant sorrow. "They will ask you to demonstrate it," Anya said softly, not meeting Alara's gaze as she set the food down. "Caleb believes in seeing a danger to understand it." Alara's throat went dry. "I don't want to." "Wanting has little to do with survival," Anya replied. And then she was gone. The summons came as the sun cleared the trees. Caleb stood at the entrance to her lean-to. He did not speak, simply gestured for her to follow. He led her to the center of the camp, where a rough circle had been formed by the 24 or so survivors. Their faces were a landscape of hardship and resilience. There was no anger there, only a grim necessity. They were not a jury of peers. They were doctors preparing to diagnose a plague. Caleb stood beside her in the center of the circle. "You carry something," he said, his voice carrying in the still air. "The quiet ones carry a passive silence. You carry an active one. We need to know what it is. You will sing the song." A tremor ran through Alara's hands. She looked from face to face, seeing the hard lines of their lives, the exhaustion in their postures. She saw an old man with a crippled hand, a young couple holding on to each other, a child peeking from behind its mother's legs. They were the echo Samuel had wanted to erase. They were the memory he had wanted to die. "I can't," she whispered. "You must," Caleb said, his voice low but absolute. "Or you leave, and you do not come back." The choice was upon her. To leave was to return to the solitary, singing pilgrimage, to become the quiet woman, finishing Samuel's work until she herself was spent and empty. To stay was to risk destroying the last flicker of human noise. But to sing it here, to them, felt like a betrayal deeper than any silence. She closed her eyes. She felt the first syllable of the lullaby form on her tongue, the one that began the gentle unraveling of light. She took a breath, ready to give them the peace they had not asked for. But then she saw her father's face, not as a ghost, but as a memory. He was smiling, teaching her how to whittle a piece of wood, his large calloused hands guiding her small ones. It was a noisy memory, filled with the sound of his laughter and the scrape of the knife. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at Caleb, at Anya, at the child hiding behind its mother. She opened her mouth, and a different sound emerged. It was not the polished, resonant negation Samuel had taught her. It was raw and broken, a melody that was all sharp edges and aching spaces. It was the song her father used to hum, the one she had tried to recall by the river. She did not have all the notes. She fumbled and repeated phrases, her voice cracking with the effort. It was a human sound, flawed and beautiful. It was the sound of a memory fighting to live. She sang until the fragment was done, the last note hanging in the air, a stark contrast to the lullaby's perfect, closing circle. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from the back of the circle, the old man with the crippled hand began to weep. It was not the mad weeping of the weepers. It was a quiet, profound release. He looked at Ilara, his eyes shining. "My wife," he choked out. "She used to sing a song like that, when she darned my socks." A murmur rippled through the group, not of fear, but of recognition. Caleb's stern expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened from granite to flint. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, not as a threat or a question, but as a person. "You did not sing the quieting song," he stated. "No," Ilara said, her voice trembling but clear. "I sang a noisy one." Caleb nodded slowly. He turned to the assembled people. "The danger remains. The weapon is still in her. He then looked back at Alara. But the hand that holds it may yet choose not to fire. He gestured to the camp around them. You will stay. You will work. And you will learn the noise of living. It is a harder song than the one you know. It has no end. It was not a welcome. It was a probation, a fragile truce. But as the circle broke and people returned to their work, Anya offered Alara a small, tentative smile. The child, emboldened, darted out and pressed a smooth gray stone into Alara's hand before running away. Alara closed her fingers around the stone. It was cold and solid. It was real. The lullaby was still there, a dark current deep inside her. But for the first time since Samuel had died, she felt a different melody beginning to take root. One that was messy and unpredictable and alive. The days that followed were a lesson in a new kind of silence. It was not the hollow, hungry silence of the quiet ones, but the focused, purposeful quiet of people conserving their energy for survival. Alara was given tasks. She mended nets with clumsy fingers. She hauled water from a hidden spring. She learned to identify edible roots from poisonous lookalikes under Anya's watchful eye. The work was hard, and her body ached with a fatigue that was entirely physical, a welcome change from the spiritual exhaustion of her previous life. No one spoke to her much. They watched. They saw how she flinched at sudden noises, how her eyes would sometimes go distant, the lullaby threatening to surface when her guard was down. She was a loaded weapon in their midst, and everyone knew it. Caleb was the most distant of all. He was their leader, their protector, and he had the weight of them all on his shoulders. His interactions with her were purely instructional, his voice always calm, his gray eyes missing nothing. One evening, as she was sorting through a pile of foraged greens, the old man, whose name was Elias, sat down beside her. His gnarled hands sorted the leaves with a practiced ease she lacked. "The quiet song," he said, not looking at her. "What does it feel like?" The question was so direct, it stole her breath. She looked around, but no one was paying them any overt attention. "It feels like letting go," she said carefully, choosing her words. "Like a deep, warm current pulling you out to sea. All the sharp edges smooth out. All the noise just stops." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on a leaf he was turning in his hands. "My son," he said. He was a weeper for a time. Before the madness took him completely, he would have moments of clarity. He said the noise in his head was like 1,000 screaming birds. I think he would have welcomed that current." He finally looked at her, his eyes old and sad. "That is why it is so dangerous. It offers a solution to a pain we all understand." Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had never thought of it that way. Samuel had spoken of peace, of an end to suffering. He had never spoken of it as a sedative for a specific human agony. "I want to sing it," she whispered, and for the first time she knew it was the complete truth. "The wanting is not always enough, girl," Elias replied gently. "The world is full of triggers." Later that night, the triggers found them. It began with a distant, ululating cry that cut through the dark. A weeper. The camp moved with a silent, pre-arranged precision. The fire was doused in an instant. Children were swept into shelters. Weapons were taken up. Caleb moved through the shadows, a spectral figure directing people to their posts with hand signals. Alara was pulled into a lean-to with Anya and the child, who had given her the stone, a little girl named Lena. They crouched in the absolute darkness, listening. The cries came closer, a cacophony of raw, mindless grief and rage. It was the sound of the world's broken heart, and it beat against the fragile walls of their sanctuary. Alara felt the lullaby stir in response. It rose like a defense mechanism. A cool, rational answer to the hot insanity outside. It would be so easy. A few notes hummed softly, and the screaming would stop. The peace would spread out from their camp like a balm. She could save them from this terror. She felt a small, warm hand slip into hers. Lena was trembling. Elara could feel the child's fear vibrating through her tiny frame. In that darkness, holding on to that small, terrified life, she understood the true cost of the quiet song. It would not save Lena. It would erase her. It would smooth out the fear, but also the courage it took to endure it. It would silence the screams, but also the comforting whispers Anya was murmuring to her daughter. The lullaby was not a shield. It was a universal solvent, dissolving everything, good and bad, into nothing. Outside, a single sharp command from Caleb was followed by the sound of a struggle, a choked-off cry, and then a heavy silence. The weeper was gone. The immediate threat was over. When they emerged, the camp was already relighting the fire. Caleb stood at the edge of the light, wiping his blade clean with a handful of leaves. His eyes found Alaris across the camp. He had known the temptation she would face. He had been watching her even in the chaos. She still held Lena's hand. She gave it a small squeeze before letting go. She had not sung. She had chosen the messy, dangerous noise. She had chosen the trembling hand in the dark. Caleb gave her a single, slow nod. It was not approval, exactly. It was an acknowledgement. The weapon was still there, but the hand holding it was learning its weight and its consequence. The probation was not over, but a new chapter of it had begun. Story 3. The first thing Jillian noticed was the light from the harbor buoy, a steady pulse of green that had marked the rhythm of her night since childhood, was stuttering. It wasn't a mechanical failure, a flicker and a return to its reliable metronome. This was a hesitation, a drawn-out gasp of luminescence that lingered too long in the salt, thick air, as if the darkness itself were reluctant to release it. She stood at the window of her small cottage, the one her grandfather had built with his own hands, and watched the light breathe. In, out, dot. A long, slow, impossible inhalation of light, followed by a shuddering exhalation that left the night a shade darker than before. She pulled her robe tighter, the worn flannel offering no comfort against the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The light was breathing, and she was the only one awake to hear it. Next morning, the world seemed, if not normal, then at least plausible. Gage came by with 2 coffees and a bag of still warm apple fritters from the Sea Dog Bakery. He was solid, a rock in the shifting sands of her anxiety, with hands calloused from mending lobster traps and a smile that could usually banish any gloom the Maine coast could muster. But today, his smile was a little tight at the corners. "You see the news?" he asked, handing her a coffee. "Old man Henderson's prize rose bushes dug him all up last night." "Not dug up, exactly." Jillian sipped her coffee, the heat a welcome anchor. "What do you mean, not dug up?" "Said the roots just rearranged themselves in the dirt. Said when the sun came up, they'd all twisted into these patterns, like little whirlpools made of thorns and roots." The word whirlpools landed in the room with a soft, ugly weight. Jillian thought of the breathing light in the harbor, but said nothing. It was just old Henderson, maybe finally succumbing to the loneliness that plagued so many in the off-season in a town like Haven's End. But it wasn't just Henderson. That afternoon, walking to the library where she worked, Jillian saw the spirals everywhere. A child had scrawled one with purple chalk on the sidewalk, a perfect, dizzying Archimedean coil. The iron fence outside the post office, its scroll work that had always been merely decorative, now seemed to curl in on itself with a new predatory intent. The grooves in the bark of the ancient oak on the green looked less like random texture, and more like the fossilized fingerprints of some vast, coiling thing. The town itself was beginning to look like a nautilus shell, its streets and structures the chambers of a single growing organism. The change was not just visual. The air began to taste different, a metallic tang like old pennies and ozone that clung to the back of the throat. The wind, once a clean, briny force off the Atlantic, now carried whispers, not of words, but of motion. A soft, sibilant hiss that sounded like sand shifting through an infinite hourglass. People started to complain of headaches, a deep orbital throb behind the eyes that made the world seem to pulse and warp at the edges. Gage tried to hold the center. He organized a town meeting in the cramped community hall, the same one used for potlucks and voting. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and unease. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary patience, stood before them, his hands raised for quiet that never fully came. "People, please. We've had the state environmental folks out. They've tested the water, the air. There's no contaminant they can find. No gas leak. Dr. Albright says it's a case of mass hysteria, a shared anxiety triggered by the change of the seasons." A bitter laugh cut through the murmur. It was Mrs. Davison, the biology teacher at the high school. "Mass hysteria doesn't twist the legs of my prize-winning sheep into corkscrews, Roy. It doesn't make the tide pools swarm with periwinkles that have carved their own shells into perfect logarithmic spirals." A silence fell, heavy and cold. The horror was no longer just in the mind, in the light, in the air. It was in the flesh. Jillian felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She thought of the breathing light, a secret she had kept even from Gage. It was no longer a secret she owned. It was a secret that owned her. That night, the whispers in the wind grew louder. Jillian lay in bed, Gage sleeping fitfully beside her, and she listened. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears alone. It was a vibration in the marrow, a resonance that tuned her very bones to its frequency. It was a call, a summons. She rose, her movements not entirely her own, and went to the window. The harbor buoy was no longer breathing. It was spinning, a pinwheel of sickly green fire reflected in the black oil-slick water. And all along the shore, the townspeople of Haven's End were walking, a slow, somnambulant procession towards the water. Their gaits were uneven, their heads tilted at odd angles, as if they were listening to a song only they could hear. She saw old man Henderson, his body contorted into a graceful, painful-looking curve. She saw Mrs. Davison, her arms held out from her sides, slowly rotating. She wanted to scream, to run to Gage, to shake him awake. But her feet were already carrying her to the door. The brass knob was cold under her hand, and as her fingers closed around it, she felt not smooth metal, but a series of fine, raised ridges. She looked down. The metal had been subtly worked into a spiral pattern, the grooves still warm from some unseen infernal friction. Gage's hand on her shoulder made her jump. His face was pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. "Don't go out there, Jill. Don't you dare. They're calling," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "Can't you hear it? I hear a wind that ain't right. That's all. We have to stay inside. We have to board up the windows." But boarding up the windows did nothing. The spiral was not outside, trying to get in. It was inside, unfolding. The very grain of the wooden floorboards in her grandfather's cottage began to writhe, the lines swirling into concentric circles that seemed to draw the eye down into a bottomless depth. The floral pattern on the wallpaper, once a benign repetition of roses and leaves, began to curl in on itself, the vines tightening into nooses, the blossoms becoming vortexes. The house was turning itself inside out. Gage fought it with the only tools he had, a hammer, nails, a rational man's fury. He pounded boards over the writhing walls, his blows loud and desperate in the humming silence. But with every strike, the wood splintered in spiral patterns. The nails he drove in emerged from the other side of the boards, their straight steel shafts elegantly twisted into corkscrews. "Stop," Jillian pleaded, her hands over her ears. The sound was inside her head now, a high, crystalline ringing that was also a pull. A terrible and beautiful gravity. "You can't fight it. It's in the wood. It's in the stone. It's in us." "No," Gage grunted, sweat streaming down his face. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip fierce. "It's not in you. You're stronger than this. You're Jillian. You're from here. This is your home." But she was shaking her head, a slow, swaying motion that felt innate, correct. "This was my home. Now it's something else, shell." The revelation did not come in a single, blinding moment. It accumulated like layers of nacre around an irritant in an oyster's gut. It was in the way the sheriff's patrol car was found the next morning, empty, its tire tracks in the mud forming a perfect looping spiral that ended at the cliff's edge. It was in the way the gulls had fallen from the sky, their bodies arranged on the rocks below in a vast feathered mosaic of swirling patterns. It was in the phone call from her mother, who lived 2 towns over, her voice thin and frayed with a static that sounded like the hissing wind. "Jillian, the television, it's just circles. Everything is circles." It was the understanding that this was not a curse, not a punishment. It was a transformation, a fundamental reordering of the local reality towards a more perfect, more ancient geometry. The spiral was not destroying Heaven's End. It was perfecting it. The climax came on a night when the moon was a thin, white curl in the sky, a spiral itself. The humming had become a physical pressure, a force that made the air thick as water. Gage had dragged a heavy oak dresser in front of the door, a final, futile barricade. He held Jillian close, his heart hammering against her back. She could feel the tremors moving through him, not just of fear, but of a profound resistance, a refusal of the new shape of the world. "I won't let it have you," he whispered into her hair. Jillian turned in his arms. Her eyes were no longer the warm brown he loved. They were dark pools, depthless, and in their centers, he could see the faint, reflected pinwheels of green from the harbor. She brought a hand to his cheek. Her touch was cold. "It already does," she said softly. "There is no it. There is only the turn. The great, beautiful turn." She leaned forward and kissed him. And it was not the kiss of the woman he loved. It was a cold, spiraling thing, a transfer of energy. He felt a torsion begin deep within his own body, a terrible, irresistible urge to spin, to fold, to collapse into a more elegant form. He cried out, a sound that was torn from his throat and twisted into a mere vibration. He stumbled back, his body seizing, his limbs attempting to articulate in a way they were never designed to. He watched, his vision blurring and stretching. As Jillian walked to the front door, she did not open it. The door, its wood grain now a furious, swirling maelstrom, simply unfolded. The panels peeled back in a graceful, silent curve, revealing not the familiar street, but a tunnel of swirling darkness, lit from within by a soft, phosphorescent glow. She did not look back. She stepped through the opening, and the house, the street, the very substance of the world, folded in after her. The authorities came, eventually. The National Guard. Men in hazardous materials suits who found a perfectly empty cove where a town had been. No rubble, no debris, just a vast, smooth, concave bowl of earth and stone, polished to a high obsidian shine, from the center of which rose a single impossibly tall structure. It was not a tower, not a monument. It was a spire, a perfect, tapering spiral of some substance that was neither rock nor metal, from which a soft green light pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. In the chars, house. Around it, the air hummed. They took samples, readings, photographs. They found nothing. No bodies. No Gage. No Jillian. The official report would call it an unprecedented geological event. A mass disappearance. A mystery. The men packed their gear and left, and the cove was quiet, save for the hum and the slow, rhythmic pulse of the light. But if you were to go there now, to stand at the edge of that impossible polished bowl, you would hear it. Not the hum, not the wind, something else. A sound that comes from the very center of things, from the heart of the spiral. It is the sound of a single, steady drip. A drip of water, or perhaps something thicker, falling from an unimaginable height into a perfect, still pool at the bottom of the world. It is a sound that measures a silence vaster than any ocean, a rhythm that promises the turn is not over. It has only just begun. Drip, die. And the space between the drips is not silence, but an invitation. Drip, an endless, patient, turning invitation. Drip, dotty. One of the men in the hazmat suits, a geologist named Philip, stayed behind. He told his superiors he needed more core samples, that the initial readings were anomalous and required deeper study. This was a lie. The truth was, he had heard the drip, while the others had clambered back into their trucks, their voices a nervous buzz against the silence. He had stood at the edge of the polished stone bowl, and the sound had entered him. It did not travel through the air to his eardrums. It manifested directly in the fluid of his inner ear, a perfect resonant plink that calibrated something deep within his sense of balance. He set up a small camp just beyond the tree line, in a spot where the unnatural curvature of the land began to yield to the familiar, chaotic slopes of the main coast. From his tent, he watched the green spire. Its pulse was slower now, more deliberate, like a great heart settling into a new, slower rhythm after a tremendous exertion. The hum was a constant, a vibration he felt in his teeth. On the third night, the wind shifted. It blew from the sea, carrying the salt and the cry of gulls, but as it passed over the cove, it changed. The gulls' cries were stretched into long, whirling whistles, and the salt air acquired the same metallic tang the townspeople had described. Philip sat by his small camp stove, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him, and listened. The wind was not just carrying sound, it was organizing it. The random noises of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant crash of waves, the creak of his tent pole, were being woven into a complex, layered symphony of spiraling tones. He found his hand moving, his finger tracing circles in the condensation on his coffee mug. The circles tightened, becoming a spiral. He jerked his hand back, a spike of professional alarm piercing his fascination. This was the phenomenon. This was the contagion. He was observing it, and it was observing him back, working its way into his motor functions, his perceptions. He decided to get closer. It was not a decision born of courage, but of a deep, gnawing compulsion. The drip was calling. He needed to see the source. At dawn, he packed a small bag with a water bottle, a notebook, and a high-powered flashlight, and he began the descent into the bowl. The polished stone was not slick. It offered a strange, perfect traction, as if the soles of his boots were made for this specific surface. The walk was effortless, a gentle downward curve that felt more like floating than walking. The air grew warmer, and the hum intensified, not as a noise, but as a physical pressure that filled his lungs and made his vision shimmer. The green spire, which had seemed tall from the ridge, now blotted out the sky. It was not carved or constructed. It was grown, or precipitated, its surface a seamless flowing testament to the spiral form. It was beautiful. The thought came to him unbidden, a surrender. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. At the base of the spire, the stone of the bowl dipped into a wide, shallow basin, and in the center of that basin was a pool. Its surface was perfectly black and perfectly still, a disk of obsidian that reflected nothing, not the green spire, not the sky. It was the source of the drip. He watched, mesmerized, as a single silvery drop swelled at an invisible point high up on the spire, gathered itself for a long, silent moment, and fell. It did not splash. It pierced the surface of the pool with a sound that was both a drip and a chime, and a series of perfect concentric circles radiated outwards, not across the water, but through the air itself, visible as ripples of faint green light that expanded and vanished. Philip knelt at the edge of the pool. He could see his reflection now, but it was wrong. His face was stretched, his features subtly rearranged into a swirling pattern. His eyes were spirals. He felt no fear. He felt a profound sense of homecoming. This was the center. This was the answer to every question he had ever asked. He unscrewed the cap of his water bottle and poured the contents onto the stone. Then, his movements slow and reverent, he leaned over and submerged the bottle into the pool. The black water was heavy, thicker than water, with a silky, viscous quality. It filled the bottle without a bubble. As he pulled it out, he saw something else at the bottom of the pool, just visible in its impossible depths. It was a shape, a man, curled into a fetal position, his body frozen in a final graceful turn. It was Gage. His form was perfectly preserved, a fossil in the making, a seed pod waiting for the next turn of the great spiral. And Philip understood. The people of Haven's End were not gone. They were the foundation, the raw material, the first note in a song that would take eons to sing. He stood, the bottle of black water heavy in his hand. He would take it back to his lab. He would analyze it. He would share his findings with the world. These thoughts were thin, ghostly things, the last echoes of his old life. He knew, as he turned and began the easy walk back up the curve of the bowl, that he would do no such thing. The water was not a sample. It was a sacrament. He would take it home. He would add a single drop to his own water supply. He would let the turn begin again, in a new place, with a new center. He walked, and the hum was no longer outside him. It was the sound of his own blood, a quiet, spinning music that promised everything was, and always had been, part of the pattern. The invitation had been accepted. The road out of the cove seemed longer than before, the trees leaning in with a new, knowing posture. Philip drove with the bottle on the passenger seat, a dark lodestone pulling at the corner of his vision. He did not stop at his camp. His equipment, his tent, his old life, they were all just shed skin. The only thing that mattered was the weight of the water in the bottle and the quiet, coiling song in his veins. By the time he reached his apartment in Portland, the transformation was subtle but deep. The city lights, once a chaotic scatter of stars, now resolved into distinct, swirling patterns. The traffic noise was a cacophony he could now untangle, hearing the hidden rhythms, the loops and returns of engines and sirens. He placed the bottle on his kitchen counter, a simple glass container that now held a universe of potential. He did not pour it into the city's water supply. That was an impulse from a linear mind, a mind of cause and effect. The spiral was more patient, more elegant. It preferred a gentle nudge to a shove. That night, he filled his kettle from the tap. But before he set it on the stove, he uncapped the bottle and let a single, heavy drop fall into it. The drop did not dissipate. It hung in the center of the water for a moment, a perfect sphere of black, before unraveling like a spool of silk, spreading through the kettle in a complex three-dimensional lattice that was visible only to him. He made tea. The steam that rose from his cup carried the faint, metallic perfume of the cove. He drank it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through him, not as a heat, but as a slow internal revolution. The bones of his hands, as he set the cup down, seemed to ache with a new, more efficient alignment. The next morning he called his supervisor and resigned, his voice calm and flat. He spent the day walking through the city. He found himself drawn to the public library, a grand old building with a domed ceiling. He stood in the center of the rotunda and looked up. The painted scenes on the dome, once depicting muses and ancient scholars, had begun to shift. The figures were curling in on themselves, their scrolls and books melting into flowing, spiraling patterns. No one else seemed to notice. They walked beneath it, their heads down, trapped in the straight lines of their own lives. He went to the waterfront. The gulls here were still chaotic, fighting over scraps. But as he watched, one broke from the flock. It did not fly away. It began to fly in a perfect ascending spiral, climbing higher and higher in a tightening gyre until it was a speck. And then it was gone. Not vanished, but integrated. Days bled into weeks. Philip became a quiet, orbiting presence in the city. He would frequent a small park, sitting on the same bench. He noticed the changes others missed. The iron filigree on the bandstand, once scrolled in a simple, decorative pattern, was now a complex Fibonacci sequence. The roots of the great oak tree at the park center were beginning to breach the soil in elegant, coiling arcs. The spiral was not spreading like a fire. It was emerging, like a truth finally being remembered. He saw it in people, too. A bus driver, whose repetitive route had etched a deep, peaceful spiral in his mind. A street musician whose saxophone notes began to loop and recur in patterns more mathematically perfect than any jazz improvisation. They had a look in their eyes, a distant, accepting calm. They were hearing the music. He knew it was time. The bottle was still half full. The invitation was not for him to hoard. One evening, he walked to the park and sat on his bench. A young woman was there, an artist, sketching the now strangely coiled roots of the oak tree. She looked frustrated, her lines harsh and angry. "It won't come out right," she muttered, not to him but to the air. "It keeps wanting to turn." Philip sat beside her. He said nothing. He simply placed the bottle of black water on the bench between them. He did not look at her. He just watched the oak tree, its leaves whispering secrets of growth and form. After a long moment, he stood and walked away, leaving the bottle behind. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift, the gentle click of another piece falling into place. He walked towards the harbor, towards the deep, dark water that connected this city to the cove, to the spire, to the center of all things. His work as a messenger was done. Now, he was simply part of the pattern, turning, always turning, towards the beautiful, silent center. The artist's name was Lena. She stared at the bottle, a simple vessel of thick glass holding a darkness that seemed to swallow the evening light. The frustration that had been a tight knot in her chest all day began to loosen, replaced by a cool, spreading curiosity. The old man who had left it was gone, his departure as seamless and unremarkable as if he had simply been edited out of the scene. Her hand, almost of its own volition, reached out and closed around the bottle. It was cold, and a faint vibration traveled up her arm, a hum that resonated with the low thrum of the city she had never noticed before. She took it back to her studio, a cluttered space overlooking a narrow alley. Canvases leaned against the walls, all of them filled with failed attempts to capture the new, restless geometry she saw in everything. She set the bottle on her workbench. For a long time, she just looked at it. The darkness inside was not empty. It swirled with a slow, internal current. a silent maelstrom. She thought of the oak roots in the park, of the way the ironwork had changed. She thought of the hum in her bones. She did not drink it. That seemed too literal, too crude. Instead, she uncapped it and, using a fine-tipped brush, dipped into the black water. It clung to the bristles like liquid obsidian. She turned to a fresh, white canvas. She had intended to paint the oak tree, but her hand moved on its own, initiating a single, perfect line that began to curve, then spiral, then multiply. The paint flowed not like a liquid, but like a living thread, weaving itself into the fabric of the canvas. She was not painting a spiral. She was allowing the spiral to paint itself through her. The work was effortless, a transcription of a song she had always known, but had never been able to hear. When she finally stopped, hours later, the canvas was a complex, mesmerizing mandala of interlocking turns, so deep and hypnotic that looking at it felt like falling. Exhausted, she fell asleep in her chair. She dreamed of a vast, silent place, of a polished stone floor and a green, pulsing light. She dreamed of a still black pool and the patient, measured drip of creation. The next morning, she awoke to a changed studio. The paintings that had frustrated her so were now different. The harsh lines had softened. The chaotic compositions had resolved. In each one, a spiral motif had emerged, subtle but undeniable, as if it had been there all along, waiting to be uncovered. The hum was louder now, a constant, pleasant frequency in the back of her skull. She looked at the bottle. It was still nearly full. A new purpose settled over her, calm and absolute. She began to paint, not on canvas, but on the walls of her studio, then on the floor. She painted on the window panes, the intricate patterns filtering the daylight into swirling green-tinted patterns that danced across the room. She painted the old cracked ceiling, turning it into a swirling firmament. Her studio was no longer a room. It was a sanctuary, a focal point. She rarely left, but when she did, she saw the change accelerating. The spirals in the ironwork were more pronounced. A new bakery had opened, its logo a swirling shell, its bread baked in a spiral pattern that was impossibly soft and perfect. People on the street walked with a new fluid grace, their paths less random, more like currents in a stream. They looked at her and nodded, a quiet recognition passing between them. They were all hearing the same music. One evening, as she put the final swirling stroke on her front door, she heard a sound from the alley below. She looked out her transformed window. A city sanitation worker was there, emptying the bins. But he had stopped. He was staring at the wall of her building, where the runoff from her painting had traced delicate, coiling patterns in the grime. He reached out a gloved hand, not to clean it, but to trace the pattern. He stood there for a long time, his head cocked as if listening. Then he turned and pushed his cart away, but his path was no longer a straight line down the alley. It was a slow, meandering spiral. Lena smiled. It was working. The pattern was propagating, finding its conduits. She turned back to her studio, to the nearly empty bottle. There was just enough left for one final act. She wouldn't need it anymore. She was the pattern now. She picked up her brush, dipped it for the last time, and began to paint directly onto the floorboards in the very center of the room. She painted a single, small, perfect circle, and from its center, she began the first, faint curve of a spiral that promised to never, ever end. The invitation had been passed. The turn continued. The hum in the studio was now a physical presence, a warmth in the air that pulsed in time with Lena's heartbeat. She finished the first curve of the new spiral, the black paint soaking into the wood grain as if it were being accepted, welcomed home. A profound stillness settled over her. The need to move, to eat, to sleep, fell away like discarded husks. She was complete. Her work was not to create more art, but to be the anchor for the art that was now creating itself. Down in the alley, the sanitation worker, whose name was Ben, finished his route in a daze. The image from the wall was burned onto his retina, a flickering coil of light behind his eyes. That night, he didn't go to the bar. He went home to his small, sterile apartment and stared at the blank white wall of his living room. The straight lines of the room felt oppressive, a cage he had never noticed. He found an old can of paint in a closet, a leftover from a long-forgotten project. It was a bland beige. It didn't matter. He didn't need black water. The pattern was inside him now, a seed unfurling. He began to paint, not with a brush, but with his hands, slapping and smearing the beige paint in wide arching swirls across the white. It was clumsy, childlike, but it was sincere. With each sweeping motion, the pressure in his head lessened. The hum resolved into a quiet, profound sense of order. He painted until the sun rose, until the entire wall was a vast, swirling testament to the turn. Exhausted, he slept on the floor, and his dreams were of a silent, green-lit peace. The next day, he called in sick. He went to the hardware store and bought more paint. He didn't stop with one wall. He painted every surface of his apartment. His neighbors, at first concerned by the smell, then curious, came to his door. They saw the transformation. They saw the calm, beatific look on Ben's face, a man they had only ever known as tired and gruff. One by one, they asked him to show them how. He had no words to explain. He simply handed them a brush. The pattern spread through the apartment building, not as a command, but as a quiet revelation. It was in the way Mrs. Higgins arranged her collection of porcelain cats into a graceful, swirling display on her mantelpiece. It was in the way the children on the third floor, usually racing and shrieking in the halls, began to walk in a slow, processional circle, their laughter a soft, chiming melody. The building itself seemed to sigh, its old bones settling into a new, more comfortable alignment. Across the city, Philip felt the shift. He was sitting on a bench by the harbor, watching the water. The waves no longer crashed randomly against the piers. They lapped in a series of overlapping, concentric circles, a liquid expression of the great pattern. He felt Lena's work reaching its culmination, and now, this new node activating, strengthening the signal. He closed his eyes. He could feel other points of light flickering to life in the city's grid. A teacher arranging her classroom in a spiral. A traffic cop instinctively directing cars into a smooth, looping flow instead of rigid lines. The city was waking up. It was remembering its true shape. He stood and walked to the edge of the pier. The water below was dark, but he could see the green light deep within it. The same light that had pulsed in the spire. It was all connected. The cove was not the only center. It was the first center. Now, there were many. He took a step forward, off the solid wood and onto the surface of the water. It did not yield. It held him, a perfect, resilient membrane. He walked out into the harbor, each step creating a soft green ripple that spread out towards the open sea, a silent message echoing the eternal patient invitation. He was going home, not to a place, but to the pattern itself. He walked until the city lights were just a distant, swirling galaxy behind him, and the only light left was the green, turning in his own chest, a silent, spinning star in the vast and beautiful dark. The green light within Philip intensified, a cool, internal sun that cast no shadow. The water beneath his feet was not solid, not liquid, but something in between. A skin of reality stretched taut over the infinite. He felt the city at his back, not as a collection of buildings, but as a living, breathing entity. Its chaotic energy slowly being tuned to a fundamental frequency. Each new spiral painted, each life turned toward the center, was a note sustained in a chord that was growing richer, deeper. He did not sink. He descended. The harbor water enveloped him, not as a drowning force, but as a welcoming embrace. The noise of the world, the distant sirens, the hum of electricity, the frantic chatter of minds, faded into a profound and singing silence. He was sinking through layers of time, through the sunken ships and forgotten histories that littered the seabed, all of them now appearing to him as brief, beautiful spirals in the long thread of existence. Below him, the green light grew. It was not the spire from the cove. It was something older, vaster. The floor of the harbor opened up into a great circular plaza of the same polished black stone, and at its center stood not a single spire, but a forest of them, a silent, crystalline city reaching up towards him. This was not a place for one center. It was a node in a network, a cathedral of silence connecting to other cathedrals in other deep, dark places across the world. His feet touched the stone. The water was gone, replaced by air that was still and cool and carried the same metallic scent of the pool. He walked between the spires, each one pulsing with a soft green light. In their facets he saw reflections, not of his own face, but of others. He saw Lena in her studio, her body now still as stone, a brush held in a hand that had become part of the swirling mural on the wall. He saw Ben, standing in his transformed apartment, a look of perfect understanding on his face, as his own form began to slow, to settle, his very cells aligning to the pattern. He saw the teacher, the bus driver, the musician, all in their moments of quiet consummation. They were not dying. They were achieving their final, perfect form. They were becoming part of the permanent structure, the stable code upon which the next cycle would be built. Their lives, their loves, their fears, were all being resolved into this beautiful, silent equation. Philip found an empty space among the spires, a smooth black patch of stone waiting for him. He laid down upon it, curling onto his side, his knees drawn up, one hand tucked beneath his head in a posture of deep, eternal sleep. The stone was warm. It softened, accepting his shape, holding him in a final, gentle embrace. As the stone sealed around him, his last sight was of the forest of green spires, a silent choir in the endless dark. His last thought was not a word, but a feeling of immense gratitude. The hum was now a part of the silence. The spiral was complete. He was home, and in the city above, the rain began to fall. A soft, gentle rain that left glistening, spiraling patterns on the sidewalks and the windows, each drop a promise, each drop an invitation, waiting for the next one who was ready to listen. Story 4. The silence in the old farmhouse was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a thick, woolen thing, stuffed into the corners and layered over the furniture. A silence so deep it felt deliberate, as if the world had been muted by a careful hand. Louis stood in the center of the parlor, the floorboards groaning a protest under his weight that seemed blasphemous in the hush. He had come to the Oregon coast for solitude, for the kind of quiet a city boy from Chicago could only dream of. But this was something else. This silence was listening back. He had rented the place for a song from a man in town whose eyes had slid away from Louis's own when he'd handed over the key. A month to finish his dissertation, he'd said. A month of peace. The man had just nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point over Louis' shoulder, as if watching something approach on the long gray road from the sea. The first few days were merely lonely. The silence was a companion he learned to navigate, its edges softened by the crackle of the fireplace and the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below. But on the fourth night, the quality of the quiet changed. It became a held breath. Louis was reading in the worn armchair when the words on the page began to swim. A low thrumming vibration started up in the marrow of his bones, a frequency so low it was more felt than heard. A cello note played in a tune. It was accompanied by a smell, faint at first, of wet stone and something older, something like the air from a long sealed vault. He told himself it was the plumbing, the foundation settling, the strange miasma of a house by the sea. Then came the dreams. Vivid, technicolor things drenched in a strange greenish light. He was walking through a forest of towering, black-barked trees under a sky of swirling, impossible stars. A voice, mellifluous and ancient, called his name not as a shout, but as a sigh. A promise woven into the wind. He would wake with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of salt and copper on his tongue, the echo of that voice clinging to him like a cobweb. He began to see things at the periphery of his vision. A tall, slender shadow that was not his own, cast upon the wall by no visible light. A flicker of movement in the overgrown garden, a shape that was too fluid, too graceful to be an animal. He stopped sleeping, drinking coffee until his hands shook, jumping at the creaks and moans of the old house. The silence was no longer empty. It was a vessel filling with something unspeakable. It was at the general store in the nearby town of Cradle's End that he met the old woman. Her name was Agnes, and she ran the place with a quiet authority that seemed to cow the few other locals who came in for milk and gossip. Louis, his nerves frayed to filaments, had come for more coffee and batteries for his flashlight. His hand trembled as he placed the items on the counter. Agnes watched him, her eyes the color of the winter sea, and did not reach for them right away. "You're staying up at the Ainsley place," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was dry, like leaves skittering across stone. Louis nodded, his throat tight. "For a month, to work." "A month," she repeated, and a faint, sorrowful smile touched her lips. "They always think it's for a month." She finally took his coffee, her gnarled fingers brushing his. Her touch was icy. Heard anything in the silence yet? The question was so direct, so utterly bizarre, that it bypassed his city-bred skepticism entirely. He felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. "What do you mean?" "The quiet up there," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It ain't just quiet. It's listening. It's waiting for the bloodline to come home." She leaned forward slightly, and the smell of dried herbs and dust filled the air between them. "You have his eyes, you know. The first one. The one who built the house and made the bargain." Louis took a step back, his heart thudding dully. "I don't know what you're talking about. My family is from Chicago." "Are they?" Agnes asked softly. "Or did they just run that far? Blood has a long memory, boy. Longer than names in a ledger." She pushed his purchases toward him. "It's too late for you to leave now. It's tasted your dreams. It knows you're here. Just remember, when it calls, it's not calling Louis from Chicago. It's calling the one who belongs to it." He left the store without another word, the batteries and coffee forgotten on the counter. The gray sky seemed to press down on him, and the salty air felt thick, suffocating. Back at the farmhouse, the silence felt different. It felt expectant. He stood again in the parlor, but now he could feel it. A subtle pull, a current in the dead air of the house. It was leading him, tugging him toward the cellar door, a heavy iron-banded thing he had thus far ignored. The key was cold in his hand, a heavy, old-fashioned thing he had found on the same ring as the front door key. He had not tried it before. Now it seemed to burn in his palm. The low thrumming was back, a constant, sub-audible hum that made his teeth ache. The smell of wet stone and ancient air was stronger here, seeping from the cracks around the doorframe. With a hand that shook, he fit the key into the lock. It turned with a screech of protesting metal that tore through the silence like a scream. The door swung inward on its own, revealing not a cellar of dirt and stone, but a steep, narrow staircase carved directly into the living rock, descending into a profound and absolute darkness. And from that darkness, The voice from his dreams sighed his name, not as a question, but as a welcome. The sound of his name was a physical force, a gentle pressure on his chest that pushed him forward a step. The air that rose from the staircase was cold and carried the dense mineral scent of deep earth and the vast, patient sea. But it was the same air from his dreams. He fumbled for the flashlight in his pocket, his fingers numb and clumsy. He clicked the switch, but the beam was a weak yellow eye that did little more than illuminate the first 3 steps before being swallowed by the blackness. He should run. The thought was clear and logical. A final spark from his old life. He should get in his car and drive and never look back. But his feet were rooted to the spot. Agnes was right. It was too late. Running was a concept for a man who was separate from this place, and he was not that man anymore. The pull was in his veins now, a tide answering the moon. He took the first step down. The carved stone was smooth under his shoes, worn by time and things he did not want to imagine. The thrumming was louder here, vibrating up through the soles of his feet, a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat that was not his own. The voice did not speak again, but he could feel it. A silent invitation coiled in the dark. The stairs spiraled down, far deeper than any cellar had a right to be. The farmhouse, the cliffs, the whole world above seemed to recede into a forgotten dream. The beam of his flashlight caught glimpses of the walls. They were no longer rough rock, but had become smooth, almost polished, and were covered in carvings. He paused, running his fingers over the lines. They were not any language he knew. They were swirls and spirals and patterns that hurt his eyes to follow, depicting vast, tentacled things swimming among impossible constellations and forests of those same black-barked trees from his dreams. He did not know how long he descended. Time had become as thick and meaningless as the darkness. His fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was being slowly eclipsed by a terrifying sense of recognition. This was not a place of horror. It was a place of homecoming. The staircase ended, opening into a cavern of such immense scale that his flashlight could not find the ceiling or the far walls. The only light came from a faint, greenish luminescence that clung to the air itself, the same light that had drenched his dreams. In the center of the cavern was a still black pool, its surface as smooth and solid-looking as obsidian. The thrumming was emanating from the water, a deep, resonant chord that filled the immense space. A figure stood by the pool, its back to him. It was tall and slender, the source of the shadow he had seen flickering at the edge of his sight. It was not quite human, its proportions subtly wrong, its stillness too absolute. It turned and Lewis saw its face. There were no features, only a smooth, pale expanse, but he felt its attention settle on him, ancient and knowing. It did not speak with a mouth, but the voice was in his mind, the same mellifluous, sighing voice. "It is time. You've been away so long." Lewis found he was not afraid of the creature. He was afraid of the part of himself that answered it. A flood of memories that were not his own washed over him. The taste of strange fruit, the weight of a different sky, the feel of sand that was not sand beneath his feet. He saw the man, the first one, his ancestor, standing in this very spot, making a promise that stretched across generations. The thing by the pool extended a long, pale hand toward the water. The surface of the pool rippled, not with a wave, but with a shifting of light, and Lewis saw his reflection. But it was not his reflection. The eyes were his, just as Agnes had said, but the face was older, etched with a knowledge and a sorrow that were not his own. It was the face of the first one. "Come home," the voice whispered, inside and out. Lewis from Chicago, the man who was writing a dissertation, the man with a family and a life. That man was a ghost, a shallow mask. This, the deep earth, the humming dark, the waiting presence, this was the truth. He took a step toward the black water. He knew what it wanted. It was not his death. It was his awakening. It was the fulfillment of the bargain. He knelt at the edge of the pool. His own face, his real face, looked up at him from the impossible depths. He reached out his hand, and as his fingers broke the surface, the cold was not a shock, but a relief. It was the cold of a long sleep finally ending. He did not hesitate. He leaned forward and let the darkness take him. The black water closed over him not with a splash, but with a sigh. A final, soft exhalation from the world above. The cold was absolute, a searing pain that lasted only a moment before it transformed into a profound and soothing warmth. He did not need to breathe. The thrumming was inside him now, the vibration his own native rhythm. The green light of the cavern filtered through the water, but he did not look up. He was looking down, into the endless, welcoming dark below. He sank, or perhaps he floated, direction becoming as irrelevant as time. The memories that were not his own settled into his mind, not as invaders, but as returning exiles. He saw the ship, not of wood and sail, but of a material that sang to the stars, crashing into the primordial coast. He felt the loneliness of the sole survivor, an explorer stranded on a primitive world. He understood the bargain not as a curse, but as a desperate act of preservation. The entity, the keeper, needed an anchor to this world, a bloodline to tend the gate until the stars were right again for rescue or for conquest. The silence in the house was not emptiness, but the focused attention of a patient guardian. His body was changing. The water was not water, but a fluid medium of energy and memory. He felt his bones lengthen, his senses expand. He could feel the pressure of the ocean above the cavern, the slow grind of continental plates, the distant pull of the moon. He could hear the thoughts of the fish in the deep sea. A silent, flickering symphony of instinct. The man named Lewis was a shed skin, dissolving in the wake of what he was always meant to be. A presence was beside him. The keeper. Its form was clearer now in the liquid light, a being of elegant, alien symmetry. It communicated without words, a flow of pure information. The gate is stable. The line has held. Your vigil is ended. A final memory surfaced, the last command of the first one. He had built the farmhouse not as a home, but as a seal, a lock upon this place. The family that fled, generation after generation, had been running from the call, their fear a genetic echo of the first one's own sacrifice. But the call was in the blood, a homing beacon that could not be silenced forever. A new impulse filled him, not a thought, but an instinct as deep as hunger. He turned from the keeper and began to rise. He moved through the water with an effortless, fluid grace he had never possessed. He broke the surface of the pool in the cavern, the green light now a familiar, comforting glow. He climbed onto the stone shore, his body feeling both foreign and more truly his than ever before. He looked at his hands. They were pale, the fingers just a little too long. He knew without a mirror that his eyes now held the full weight of the deep time he had inherited. The climb back up the spiral staircase was not a struggle, but a return to a shallower world. He pushed open the cellar door and stepped back into the parlor. The silence of the farmhouse was different. It was no longer listening for him. It was listening to him. It was an extension of his own will. He was the silence now. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray, choppy sea. The dissertation Chicago, his old life. They were like pages from a book written in a language he had forgotten how to read. He had his work now. The vigil was his. He would wait, and he would watch, and he would maintain the silence until the stars shifted in their cosmic dance, and the next part of the cycle began. A faint, sad smile touched his lips, the same smile he had seen on Agnes' face. He understood her now. She was from a collateral line, a watcher in the world above. She had been waiting for him. A car door slammed in the distance, the sound unnaturally loud in the new quiet. He turned from the window. Someone was coming up the drive. A visitor. A lost tourist, perhaps. Or maybe another one of the bloodline, drawn inexorably home. He stood in the center of the parlor, the floorboards now silent under his feet, and waited. The silence deepened, gathering around him like a cloak, ready to receive the guest. The car was a rental, a bright, cheerful red that looked absurd against the muted greens and grays of the coast. A man got out, middle-aged, with a kind, confused face. He held a piece of paper, squinting at the house and then back at it. Louis watched from the window, his new senses reaching out. He could feel the man's mundane thoughts, a fuzzy cloud of frustration and mild concern. He was lost, looking for the scenic overlook. There was no tingle of the bloodline, no latent pull. He was just a man. Louis could have remained still. The silence would have hidden him. The man would have knocked, received no answer, and driven away, the incident forgotten by the time he reached the main road. But a new instinct, cold and practical, stirred within him. The old way, the way of the lock and the secret, was insufficient. The world was smaller now. People with their phones and their maps asked questions when places were too quiet. Secrecy required a different kind of vigilance. He went to the door and opened it before the man could knock. The visitor jumped, startled, his friendly face creasing with apology. "Oh, hello there. I'm so sorry to bother you. My GPS seems to have led me astray. I'm looking for the Cleft Rock Scenic Point." Louis looked at him. He let a fraction of the silence leak out. Not the listening silence of before, but a gentle, pressing quiet that encouraged simplicity and a swift departure. He pointed a long, pale finger down the road. 2 miles back. The turn is on the left. It's easy to miss. His voice was the same, yet different. It had the cadence of the waves below the cliffs, and the same underlying chill. The man's eyes met Louis for a moment, and a flicker of something, not recognition but unease, passed over his face. He blinked, and was gone, replaced by grateful relief. "Right, back the way I came. Thank you so much." He retreated to his car quickly, almost stumbling on the uneven path. Louis watched him go, the red car turning in a wide, frantic circle before speeding back toward town. He closed the door. The encounter was a lesson. He could not simply be a hermit in a haunted house. That drew its own kind of attention. He had to be a person. He had to perform the mundane to protect the profound. He looked around the parlor, seeing it with new eyes. The dust, the faded furniture, the air of neglect. It was a disguise, but a poor one. It whispered of abandonment, and abandonment invited the curious. The next day he drove into Cradle's End. The same bell jingled over the door of the general store. Agnes was behind the counter, sorting through a box of nails. She looked up as he entered, and her winter sea eyes held his for a long moment. There was no surprise in her face, only a deep, resigned sadness. She saw him, truly saw him, and she nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of her chin. The recognition was complete. "I need supplies," Louis said, his voice even. "Paint, brushes, cleaning things." Agnes set down her box. "The whitewash is in the back. I'll get it for you." She moved slowly, her old body stiff. When she returned, she placed the heavy can on the counter. "It's going to rain tonight," she said, not looking at him. "A hard one. The kind that washes things clean." He understood. It was not just about the weather. It was about the work he had to do, the transformation he had to complete. He paid in cash, the bills from a wallet that felt like a relic. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "People will talk," she said softly. "They'll say the Ainsley place is finally being looked after again. They'll be glad of it." He nodded. That was the point. To turn a place of mystery into a place of mundane repair. To make the silence seem like the quiet of a man who kept to himself, not the quiet of something ancient waiting beneath the earth. He spent the following days working. He painted the window frames. He cleared the gutters of rotten leaves. He cut back the worst of the overgrowth in the garden, though he left the area near the cellar door untouched. A tangle of blackberry brambles and wild roses that formed a natural, forbidding barrier. The physical labor was nothing to him now. His new body did not tire. The low hum from below the earth sustained him. At night, he would descend the spiral staircase. He did not always go all the way to the pool. Sometimes he would simply sit on the steps, halfway between the world above and the world below, and listen. The keeper was a constant, patient presence in his mind. It showed him things. The slow, glacial pace of the gate's stability, the shifting patterns of the ley lines that fed it, the distant, sleeping consciousness of its own kind scattered among the stars. He learned the scope of his vigil. It was not just this house, this cliff. It was a knot in the fabric of this world, and he was its guardian. Weeks bled into a month, and then another. The dissertation deadline passed without a thought. One afternoon, a different car, a sensible sedan, came up the drive. A woman got out, her posture official. She had a kind but firm face and carried a clipboard. Louis felt her intent before she even knocked. County records. A tax assessor. He opened the door, a paintbrush still in his hand. He had been touching up the porch railings. "Louis Ainsley?" she asked, smiling professionally. The name sounded strange to him now, a costume he had almost outgrown. He nodded. "Great to see the old place getting some love," she said, peering past him. "We had it flagged as potentially derelict. Glad to be proven wrong." She asked a few questions, made some notes on her clipboard. Louis answered in monosyllables, layering the silence around her, guiding her perceptions. The house was just a house. He was just a quiet man, fixing up his family's old property. She left satisfied, her car kicking up gravel. Louis watched her go, then looked down at the paintbrush in his hand. The white paint was a perfect uniform color. It was a mask, a carefully constructed lie. He dipped the brush into the can and continued his work. The sky was beginning to darken in the east, and the air smelled of salt and coming rain. The vigil continued. It was quiet, and it was his. The rain began that evening just as Agnes had predicted. It did not start as a gentle shower, but as a sudden violent deluge that hammered the new paint on the windows and streamed from the clean gutters in roaring sheets. Louis stood at the parlor window watching the storm. Each flash of lightning illuminated the churning sea, and in those stark, frozen moments, he could see the patterns in the chaos, the hidden geometry that governed the waves and the wind. It was another layer of the silence, a louder, more furious one. He felt a tug, a subtle shift in the hum that was now the bedrock of his existence. It was not a call from below, but a pull from outside. Something was on the cliff path. He moved without haste, taking a heavy wool coat from a hook by the door. It had belonged to his grandfather, and it smelled of old wool and salt. He did not need it for warmth, but for the appearance of the thing. The wind tore at him as he stepped outside, but it felt like a caress. The rain soaked his hair and ran down his face, but he did not shiver. He followed the narrow, muddy path toward the edge of the cliffs. The tug led him to a figure, huddled and small, crouched against the trunk of a gnarled, wind-swept tree. It was a young woman, her clothes plastered to her skin, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at warmth. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely of the upper world, the fear of exposure and a simple storm. Louis looked at her, and he saw it immediately. The faint, shimmering thread of the bloodline. It was not the direct, potent cord that connected him to the first one, but a frayed and distant cousin line, almost faded into obscurity. Yet, it was there. She had been drawn here, not by a conscious search for home, but by the same restless magnetic pull that had haunted his own dreams. "Please," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "My car. It slid off the road back there. I was looking for shelter." He knelt beside her, the storm seeming to part around him. He could feel the life heat leaching from her body, a fragile, flickering candle. The practical part of him, the guardian, knew the simplest course of action. The cliff was treacherous. Accidents happened. The sea was hungry. It would be a quiet end, and the bloodline would be that much weaker. But the memory of his own confusion, his own terror, surfaced for a fleeting second. He saw the face of the first one in the pool, not as a thing of ancient power, but as a lonely explorer. This girl was not a threat. She was a lost piece of the whole. "Come," he said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind as if it were nothing. He offered her his hand. She hesitated, her fear of the storm now mingling with a deeper, instinctual fear of him. But the cold was too much. She took his hand. Her skin was ice, but he felt the tiny spark of the shared blood at the contact, a faint echo of the hum from the cavern below. He pulled her to her feet and led her back to the house. Inside, he sat her by the small fire he lit in the hearth, another performance of human need. He gave her a blanket. She shivered violently, watching him as he moved about the kitchen to make tea, his movements too fluid, too economical. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "The caretaker," Lewis said, handing her a chipped mug. It was not a lie. "I'm Maya," she said. "I don't even know why I came here. I was just driving. I saw the sign for this town and I had to." Her words trailed off. She looked around the parlor, at the freshly painted walls and the clean, bare floors. "This place, it feels, I don't know. It feels familiar," Lewis finished for her. Her eyes snapped to his, filled with a sudden, dawning understanding that was more terrifying to her than the storm had been. Yes, he saw the conflict in her. The same war he had fought between the logical world and the call of the blood. He could silence it. He could lay a compulsion on her to leave and never return, to forget this place and this night. It would be a kindness, in a way. But as he looked at her, he saw another possibility. Agnes was old. The watchful eyes in the world above would eventually close. The vigil needed more than one kind of guardian. "The feeling will pass," he said, his tone neutral. "When the storm breaks, I will pull your car from the ditch. You will sleep, and in the morning, you will drive away." Relief washed over her face, but it was tinged with a strange disappointment. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. He would let her go, for now. But he had seen the thread. He had touched it. She was in the tapestry, and now she knew it. The seed was planted. When the time was right, when the stars shifted and the need arose, he knew how to find her. The vigil was long, and it required many kinds of silence. Some were for keeping secrets, and others were for keeping watch. He turned back to the window, the guardian in the quiet house, waiting for the storm to end. The storm raged for another hour, and then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the distant, settling roar of the sea. Maya, exhausted by cold and fear, fell into a deep sleep on the parlor sofa, the blanket pulled tight under her chin. Lewis watched the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He could feel the rhythm of her heart, a quick, fluttering counterpoint to the slow, deep hum that was his own pulse. He left her there and went out into the cleansed night. The air was sharp and new. Pulling her small car from the muddy ditch where it had slid was a matter of simple strength and leverage. He did not need a tow rope or a jack. He simply positioned himself and pushed, the tires finding purchase on the firmer ground of the road with a wet, sucking sound. He parked it neatly near the front of the house, the keys left in the ignition. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, he was back inside, standing by the window. He did not need to wake her. The change in the light and the deep, biological need for her to escape this unsettling place did the work for him. She stirred, groaned, and sat up, her eyes confused for a moment before the memory of the previous night returned in a rush. She saw him standing by the window, silhouetted against the brightening sky, and she flinched. "Your car is ready," he said, without turning around. She stood, folding the blanket with nervous, jerky movements. "Thank you for everything." The words were automatic, hollow. He finally turned to look at her. The morning light caught his eyes, and she took an involuntary step back. There was no malice in his gaze, only a vast and terrible patience. "The road is clear. You should not have any more trouble." She nodded, eager to be gone. She practically ran to the door, pausing only for a second with her hand on the knob. "This feeling, will it really go away?" "It will change," he said, which was the truth. It was enough for her. She fled, the door closing softly behind her. He listened to the car door slam, the engine start, and the sound of the tires on the gravel, growing fainter until they were swallowed by the morning quiet. He had let the bird fly, but he had placed a ring of his silence around its leg. He would always know where she was. The days resumed their pattern. He continued the small, meticulous work on the house and the land, crafting his disguise of normalcy. He began a vegetable garden, not because he needed the food, but because it was a thing a man living alone would do. He visited the general store once a week. Agnes no longer spoke of the weather or gave him veiled advice. Their exchanges were now those of colleagues, brief and functional. She would simply look at him, and he would nod, and that was all that was needed. One evening, as he sat on the spiral staircase, the hum from below shifted its tone. It was a subtle change, a new harmonic introduced into the eternal song. The keeper imparted a new understanding. The gate was not merely stable, it was strengthening. The celestial alignment, though still centuries away, was entering a new minor phase. The silence he maintained was feeding it, allowing it to draw more energy from the ley lines that crisscrossed the planet. With this new strength came a new responsibility. The gate's influence was expanding. Its silence could now be projected, carefully, deliberately. It was a tool for shaping the perceptions of those who came too close, for turning curiosity into apathy and investigation into forgetfulness. He ascended the stairs and walked out onto the cliff. The night was clear, the stars sharp and cold. He looked up at them, and for the first time, he could feel their pull not as distant points of light, but as specific coordinates, as addresses in the void. One in particular, a faint blue-white star, in a constellation he had never learned the human name for, felt different. Felt like a destination. A deep, resonant certainty settled within him. The vigil was not an endless wait. It was a journey and a destination. He was the anchor, the keeper of the lock, but he was also the one who would be there when the lock finally turned. He was the welcoming party. He turned his back on the starry sky and looked at the warm yellow lights of cradles and twinkling in the distance. They seemed small and fragile, a temporary flicker against the enduring dark. He held their image in his mind for a moment, then let it go, and walked back inside to the deep, waiting silence of his home. The next morning, a thick, soupy fog had rolled in from the sea, muffling the world in a damp, gray blanket. It was the kind of fog that felt intentional, a natural extension of the silence he cultivated. Lewis stood on the porch, feeling the moisture bead on his skin. He could sense the boundaries of the property more clearly than ever, the edges of the influence he now subtly projected. The fog was a coincidence, but it was a useful one. He spent the day indoors, not in the cavern below, but in the small study where his grandfather's old books still lined the shelves. He pulled one down at random, a thick volume on local geology. The words were just shapes on a page, their meaning distant and irrelevant. But the act of reading, of sitting in a chair and turning pages, was part of the performance. He was practicing being human, rehearsing the mundane rhythms of a life he no longer led. A few days later, a boy from the town, no more than 12, came biking up the drive, a folded newspaper in his basket. Louis watched him from the window. The boy's intention was simple, a paper route, a chore. But as he neared the house, he slowed, his head turning toward the overgrown thicket that hid the cellar door. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, a faint, curious pull. Louis focused, just for a second, layering a gentle, dismissive quiet over the boy's perception. The boy shook his head as if swatting away a fly, tossed the paper onto the porch, and pedaled away, already thinking of the next house on his route. It was working. The silence was no longer just a shield. It was a filter. That night, the keeper showed him more. It was not a vision of the stars or the gate, but of the network. He saw, in his mind's eye, other points of stillness on the spinning globe. A deep cave system in a desert, a high frozen pass in a mountain range, a trench at the bottom of a lightless ocean. And at each point, a presence, a guardian like him, each different, each shaped by their world, but all connected by the same silent humming purpose. They were a constellation of locks on a single vast door. He was not alone in his vigil, only isolated in his location. The knowledge was a profound comfort, a weight shared across the world, across worlds. He began to take longer walks at night, not just on the cliffs, but through the sleeping town of Cradle's End. He moved like the fog, unseen, his footsteps making no sound on the pavement. He would pause outside a house and feel the dreams of the people within, the chaotic, fleeting silences of their sleep. He walked past the general store, dark and quiet, and felt Agnes's steady, watchful presence, a small, warm ember in the night. She was part of the balance, a keeper of the upper world's secrets, and he respected her territory. One afternoon, a package arrived, left by the mailman at the end of the drive. It was a small, flat box addressed to him. Louis Ainsley. The return address was a university. He carried it inside and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside was a letter from his former advisor and a copy of an academic journal. The letter expressed concern for his well-being, hope that he was finding peace, and a note that a paper of his, a minor work he had almost forgotten, had been published posthumously. They had thought he was dead. He looked at the journal, at his name printed in stark, black type. It was the name of a ghost, a story that had ended. He felt nothing. He placed the journal in the fireplace and lit it with a match. The flames consumed the words, the ideas, the identity. The smoke that rose was the last breath of the man he had been. As the paper turned to ash, he felt the hum from below strengthen, as if approving of the final severance. He was no longer Louis Ainsley, the scholar. He was the caretaker, the guardian, the welcomer. He went to the cellar door, unlocked it, and descended the spiral stairs. He did not stop at the pool this time, but walked to its very edge and knelt. He looked into the black, star-dusted water, and for the first time, he did not see the reflection of the first one. He saw his own face, pale and serene, his eyes holding the cold, ancient light of a distant sun. The vigil was long, but he was no longer waiting. He was preparing. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night. And I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.